Hello there, and welcome to Biology with Charles. Wherever you are right now, whatever the light looks like outside your window, this is a quiet place to slow things down and spend a little time with how the mind actually works when it isn't announcing itself. If you've just settled in for the evening, or if you're listening while the rest of the world is already asleep, you're in good company. This channel has always been about taking familiar ideas from biology and psychology and looking at them from a slightly calmer angle, one that doesn't rush to impress or overwhelm, but instead stays close to how these systems show up in everyday life. Tonight the focus is on something that has been with you every moment you've been alive, something that influences what you notice, what you avoid, what feels comfortable, and what feels wrong, often before you have any conscious opinion about it at all. It's the part of the mind that doesn't ask for instructions, doesn't wait for permission, and doesn't explain itself afterward. It runs quietly in the background, making adjustments, drawing conclusions, preparing reactions, and nudging behaviour long before conscious thought catches up. We usually call it the subconscious, though that word has meant different things at different times, and it's often used loosely. What matters here isn't the label, but the function. This is the layer of the mind that keeps things moving while you're busy thinking you're in charge. You might already have a sense of it from small moments. The way your hand pulls back from a hot surface before you can form a sentence about it. The feeling of discomfort in a room before you've identified why. The sudden urge to check your phone without deciding to do so. These things don't feel like decisions. They feel like they happen first, and only later do you explain them to yourself. That order matters. It tells us something important about how the mind is organised and about how much of daily life is shaped before conscious awareness steps in. Before going further, it's worth asking something simple and personal. Where are you listening from right now? Not in a geographic sense, but in a situational one. Are you lying down, sitting, moving through a familiar route, or staying awake longer than you planned? And what kind of mental space are you in? Alert, tired, distracted, quietly curious? The reason that question matters is that your current state is already influencing how the information ahead will land. The subconscious is not waiting until later to get involved. It's already filtering, prioritizing, and interpreting before each sentence finishes. If you find this kind of exploration steadying, or if it gives your mind something gentle to focus on while the day winds down, you're always welcome to like the video or subscribe. It helps this channel reach others who are also looking for slower explanations and calmer pacing. There's no urgency. Everything here is meant to work at its own speed. Now, when people hear the word subconscious, they often imagine something dramatic or mysterious, a hidden vault of memories, a second mind lurking beneath the surface. Sometimes it's described as a shadow version of the self filled with repressed thoughts or secret desires. That image is understandable, but it's not especially accurate. The reality is both more ordinary and more influential. The subconscious is not a separate entity. It's a collection of processes, fast ones, automatic ones, systems that evolved to keep organisms alive and functioning long before language, reflection, or self-awareness entered the picture. To understand why it has so much influence, it helps to step back and consider how the brain developed. Conscious, deliberate thought is a relatively recent addition in evolutionary terms. For most of the history of nervous systems, there was no time for reflection. An organism that paused to analyse every stimulus did not last long. What survived were systems that could detect patterns, predict outcomes, and initiate action quickly. Those systems didn't disappear when conscious thought evolved. They stayed. They still do most of the work. Conscious awareness was layered on top, not placed in control. This means that much of what feels like choice is actually response. You notice something after your brain has already categorized it as relevant or irrelevant. You feel drawn towards something after your internal systems have assessed it as safe or rewarding. You feel resistance before you know what you're resisting. By the time a thought enters awareness, several steps have already happened. Signals have been evaluated, memories have been consulted, emotional tags have been applied. The subconscious doesn't wait for instructions because it can't afford to. This is not a flaw in the system, it's the system working as designed. Imagine if every breath required conscious effort. Imagine if balance, posture, and muscle coordination had to be planned one step at a time. Life would be unmanageable. The subconscious handles complexity so that consciousness can focus on narrower tasks. The problem arises not because the subconscious exists, but because we tend to misunderstand its role. We often assume that awareness is the driver and that automatic processes are secondary. In reality, it's often the reverse. Consider how often you act first and explain later. You say yes to something without knowing why. You feel uneasy about a person who hasn't done anything wrong. You avoid a task even though you understand its importance. Later, your conscious mind steps in and creates a narrative. It offers reasons. It fills in gaps. Sometimes those explanations are accurate, sometimes they're not. But they serve an important purpose. They maintain the sense that there is a coherent self making decisions. The subconscious doesn't provide commentary. Consciousness does. This division of labour has consequences. It means that insight alone does not always lead to change. You can understand a habit and still repeat it. You can recognise a pattern and still fall into it. That's because habits, preferences, and emotional reactions are not stored where reasoning lives. They are encoded in systems designed for efficiency, not explanation. The subconscious is concerned with what has worked before, not with what should work now. This is why early experiences matter so much, not because they define a person forever, but because they shape the initial settings of these automatic systems. Repeated exposure teaches the subconscious what to expect, what leads to reward, what leads to discomfort, what requires vigilance. Over time, those expectations become default responses. They operate quietly, often invisibly, influencing perception and behaviour without announcing themselves. Language complicates this further. We often talk about the mind as if it were a single voice. But internally, there is no central narrator. There are signals, networks, and competing priorities. Conscious thought is more like a summary than a transcript. It receives the end result of many processes, not the step-by-step details. This can create the illusion that thoughts simply appear, fully formed, without origin. In a sense, that's exactly what happens. The origin just isn't accessible in the same way. This doesn't mean the subconscious is irrational or chaotic. It follows rules. It learns from repetition. It updates based on outcomes. But its logic is statistical, not verbal. It doesn't reason through arguments. It adjusts probabilities. If something consistently leads to relief, it becomes more likely. If something leads to discomfort, it becomes less likely. Over time, these adjustments shape behaviour in ways that feel personal, but are grounded in pattern recognition. You can see this clearly in simple learning. Touch something hot once and your body learns quickly. You don't need to remind yourself. The reaction is automatic, but the same mechanism applies to social experiences, emotional interactions, and internal states. Repeated stress teaches the system to stay alert. Repeated unpredictability teaches it to anticipate threat. Repeated reassurance teaches it to relax. These lessons don't arrive as thoughts, they arrive as tendencies. One of the most common misunderstandings is the idea that the subconscious is always correct or always wise. It is efficient, not accurate. It generalizes quickly, sometimes too quickly. It prioritizes safety over truth. If avoiding something once reduced discomfort, it may continue to avoid similar situations even when the context has changed. From the subconscious perspective, false positives are acceptable. Missing a real threat is not. This bias shapes anxiety, avoidance, and many automatic emotional reactions. Another misunderstanding is that the subconscious is fixed. It is adaptable, but it changes slowly. It responds to consistency, not intention. Telling yourself to feel differently rarely works because words are not the language it understands. Experience is, repetition is, context is. This is why change often feels frustrating. Conscious awareness recognizes a problem long before the deeper systems adjust. During that gap, behavior feels out of sync with understanding. None of this makes the subconscious an enemy. It makes it a powerful partner that operates on different rules. Problems arise when there is misalignment, when conscious goals conflict with automatic tendencies, when understanding is ahead of habit, when identity has changed but internal expectations have not yet caught up. This tension is a common feature of human experience, even if it's rarely described in these terms. As we move forward, it will become clearer how these systems interact, how automatic processes influence attention, how emotion guides decision-making before logic enters the picture, how memory shapes perception, how the body participates in what we call thought. None of this happens in isolation. The subconscious is not a single place or function. It is distributed. It is embedded in perception, movement, emotion, and learning. It is the reason life feels continuous rather than manually controlled. For now, it's enough to recognize one simple idea. Much of what feels like you is happening before you notice it. That doesn't reduce agency, it reframes it. Influence over these systems comes not from force, but from understanding how they learn and what they respond to. That understanding begins with letting go of the idea that awareness is the starting point. More often than not, it's the last to know. As we continue, attention will shift toward how this hidden machinery first develops, how it divides labour with conscious thought, and why it ends up running so much of daily life without ever introducing itself. The transition from thinking about the subconscious as a vague concept to seeing it as a set of active, measurable processes tends to change how people notice their own reactions. Not all at once, gradually, in small moments where behaviour makes a little more sense than it did before. When people say the word subconscious, they often mean very different things, even if they don't realise it. Sometimes they mean thoughts they're not paying attention to. Sometimes they mean emotions that seem to come from nowhere. Sometimes they mean habits, instincts, gut feelings, or even a vague sense that something is off without knowing why. In everyday language, the word gets used as a catch-all for anything mental that doesn't feel deliberate. That looseness makes it useful in conversation, but it also makes it misleading. To understand how the subconscious actually runs so much of life, it helps to be more precise about what the word is pointing to, and, just as importantly, what it is not. At its simplest, the subconscious refers to mental processes that operate without conscious awareness, but still influence perception, decision-making, emotion, and behaviour. These processes are not hidden in a single location in the brain, and they are not a separate mind living underneath your conscious one. They are systems, networks, mechanisms that work automatically, quickly, and continuously. They do not announce themselves, and they do not wait for approval. They simply do their job, which is to keep the organism functioning in a complex and unpredictable environment. One way to clear up confusion is to separate the subconscious from two ideas it is often mixed up with. The first is the unconscious as it appears in popular culture, especially in older psychoanalytic traditions. That version of the unconscious is often portrayed as a dark storage room filled with repressed memories, forbidden desires, and unresolved conflicts. While early psychologists like Freud used the term unconscious in a very specific theoretical way, modern neuroscience does not support the idea of a single hidden vault where troubling thoughts are locked away. That doesn't mean past experiences don't matter or that emotions can't operate outside awareness. It means the mechanism is far more distributed and mundane than the dramatic imagery suggests. The second idea the subconscious gets confused with is simple in attention. If you're driving a familiar route and suddenly realise you don't remember the last few minutes, it's tempting to say your subconscious took over. In a sense, that's true, but not because consciousness turned off. What actually happened is that well-learned systems handled the task without needing detailed monitoring. Attention shifted elsewhere because it was no longer required for moment-to-moment control. The processes were always there. You just weren't narrating them. This points to a useful distinction. Consciousness is not the same thing as control. You can be aware without being in charge, and you can be in charge without being aware. The subconscious handles control of many functions precisely because it does not need conscious input. Walking, speaking, recognizing faces, interpreting tone of voice, adjusting posture, and predicting what will happen next in a conversation all rely heavily on processes that operate below awareness. Conscious thought steps in mainly when something goes wrong, something is new, or something requires deliberate planning. Another way to think about the subconscious is as the brain's efficiency system. The brain consumes a large amount of energy relative to its size. To manage that cost, it automates anything that can be automated. Repetition is the key signal. If a pattern occurs often enough and leads to a predictable outcome, the brain stops allocating conscious resources to it. This frees awareness for tasks that genuinely require flexibility. The subconscious is not lazy, it is economical. This efficiency shows up in perception itself. You do not consciously construct the world you see. Light hits the retina, signals are processed through multiple layers of visual cortex, edges are detected, movement is inferred, depth is estimated, and objects are categorized before you ever have the experience of seeing. By the time you notice a chair, your brain has already decided that it is a chair, that it is solid, that it can support weight, and that it is not a threat. All of that happens automatically. You experience the result, not the computation. The same is true for sound. You don't hear raw vibrations, you hear language, music, footsteps, intention. Your subconscious filters noise, predicts what sound should come next, and flags deviations. This is why you can tune out background noise but instantly notice your name spoken across a room. That reaction is not conscious choice. It is relevance detection, handled by systems that continuously scan for meaning. Emotion is another domain where the subconscious does most of the work. Emotional responses often begin before conscious interpretation. The body reacts, heart rate changes, muscles tense or relax, hormones are released. Only afterward does the conscious mind label the feeling. Fear, for example, is not something you decide to feel. It is a coordinated response to perceived threat, triggered by rapid evaluation systems designed to err on the side of caution. The feeling is the conscious echo of a process already underway. This timing matters. It explains why reasoning with emotions often feels ineffective in the moment. By the time a thought like, "this isn't dangerous," forms, the body is already prepared for action. The subconscious does not wait for a committee meeting. It acts first and lets explanation catch up later. This doesn't mean reasoning is useless. It means reasoning works on a different timescale. Memory also operates largely outside awareness. You do not choose which memories come to mind or how strongly they are associated with emotion. Certain smells, sounds, or environments can trigger feelings or recollections without conscious intent. This happens because memory is not stored as a single file. It is distributed across sensory, emotional, and contextual networks. When part of that network is activated, the rest can follow automatically. Importantly, the subconscious does not just store past information, it actively predicts the future. Modern neuroscience increasingly describes the brain as a prediction machine. Based on past experience, it constantly generates expectations about what will happen next. These predictions shape perception itself. You don't passively receive reality, you actively anticipate it. When reality matches the prediction, everything feels smooth and familiar. When it doesn't, attention is drawn, and conscious awareness becomes more involved. This predictive function is one of the most powerful ways the subconscious shapes daily life. Expectations influence what you notice, how you interpret ambiguous situations, and how you respond to uncertainty. If your system predicts rejection, neutral interactions may feel threatening. If it predicts safety, the same interactions may feel unremarkable. These predictions are not beliefs in the philosophical sense. They are learned probabilities, updated through experience. Language often gives the impression that the subconscious is irrational, while the conscious mind is logical. That division is not accurate. The subconscious follows its own logic, one based on pattern recognition and statistical learning rather than explicit rules. It is extremely good at detecting regularities, even when it cannot explain them. This is why people can have accurate gut feelings without being able to articulate why. The explanation exists at the level of patterns, not sentences. At the same time, the subconscious can be stubborn. Once a pattern is learned, it does not update easily based on isolated information. It prefers consistency. This is why habits persist even when motivation changes. It is why fears can linger after danger has passed. The system that learned the pattern requires repeated evidence before it revises its expectations. One insight rarely outweighs many experiences. This brings us to an important clarification. The subconscious is not a moral agent. It does not care about values, ideals, or long-term meaning. It cares about what has reduced discomfort and increased stability in the past. If avoidance once led to relief, it will favour avoidance. If people-pleasing once prevented conflict, it will favour that. These strategies may become outdated, but the system does not evaluate them philosophically. It evaluates them pragmatically. Another misconception is that the subconscious is always personal. In reality, many of its functions are shared across humans. The basic architecture of threat detection, reward learning, social bonding, and habit formation is remarkably similar from person to person. Individual differences arise from experience layered onto that shared structure. Culture, upbringing, trauma, routine, and environment all tune the same underlying machinery in different ways. It's also worth noting that the boundary between conscious and subconscious is not fixed. Processes can move from one to the other. When you first learn a skill, it requires focused attention. Over time, with practice, it becomes automatic. The opposite can also happen. When something goes wrong with an automatic process, consciousness rushes in. Think of walking on ice. Suddenly, something you never think about becomes the center of attention. This flexibility is a feature, not a bug. Neuroscientifically, there is no single line in the brain where consciousness ends and the subconscious begins. Different processes become conscious under different conditions, some never do. The distinction is functional rather than anatomical. It describes whether information is globally available to awareness, not where it lives. Understanding this helps avoid a common trap, treating the subconscious as something mystical or unreachable. It is not hidden behind a locked door. It is expressed constantly through behavior, emotion, posture, attention, and reaction. The difficulty is not access, it is interpretation. Because these processes do not use language, we often misread their signals or overlay stories that feel plausible but are incomplete. When people say, "My subconscious made me do it," what they usually mean is that an automatic process influenced behavior without conscious deliberation. That influence can be strong, but it is not destiny. Awareness changes the environment in which the subconscious learns. Repeated attention, new experiences, and different outcomes all feed back into the system. The subconscious is shaped by what happens, not by what is declared. As this discussion continues, the focus will narrow further. From this broad definition, attention will move toward how the brain divides labor between fast and slow systems, why some thoughts feel deliberate while others feel intrusive, and how these automatic processes quietly guide decisions that feel deeply personal. The goal is not to diminish the role of conscious thought, but to place it in context. Once that context becomes clearer, many everyday frustrations begin to make more sense, not because they disappear, but because the machinery behind them becomes easier to recognize as it operates. The human brain does not operate at a single pace. It never has. From the outside, it can feel like thoughts arrive one at a time, lined up neatly, waiting to be considered. From the inside, though, the reality is far messier and far more interesting. At any given moment, multiple systems are working in parallel, each with its own priorities, speed, and method of operation. Some of these systems are slow, deliberate, and effortful. Others are fast, automatic, and largely invisible. Together they form what can be described as a two-speed brain, not as a metaphor but as a practical way of understanding how thought actually unfolds. The slower system is the one most people identify with. It is the voice in your head that reasons, reflects, compares options, and forms sentences. It is the part that feels like you when you're thinking something through. This system is conscious, but it is also limited. It can only hold a small amount of information at once. It tires easily. It requires energy and attention. When you are mentally exhausted, this is the system that feels depleted. The faster system operates differently. It does not speak in sentences. It does not wait for questions. It reacts, predicts, categorizes, and initiates responses in fractions of a second. This system handles most of what keeps you functioning smoothly from moment to moment. It recognizes faces, interprets tone of voice, assesses danger, retrieves habits, and prepares emotional responses before the slower system has time to comment. Most of the time, it works so well that you don't notice it at all. This division is not a flaw or a contradiction. It is a solution to a biological problem. The world moves quickly. If every stimulus required careful analysis, survival would be impossible. At the same time, flexibility matters. When something new or complex appears, automatic reactions are not enough. The brain needed a way to balance speed with adaptability. The result is a layered system, where fast processes handle the familiar and predictable, while slower processes step in when something requires change. One of the clearest ways to see this difference is through reaction time. If you touch something hot, your hand pulls away almost instantly. The signal travels from the skin to the spinal cord and triggers a reflex before the brain has time to form a conscious experience of pain. Only afterward do you become aware of what happened. That sequence reveals a basic principle. Action does not wait for awareness. Awareness often arrives after the fact. This principle extends far beyond physical reflexes. Emotional reactions follow a similar pattern. You may feel uneasy in a situation before you can articulate why. Your body shifts, your attention narrows, your breathing changes. Only later does the slower system begin to analyze the environment and search for explanations. Sometimes it finds a clear reason, sometimes it doesn't. Either way, the reaction has already occurred. The fast system excels at pattern recognition. It is constantly scanning for regularities based on past experience. When it detects something familiar, it activates the associated response. This happens without deliberation. You do not decide to recognize a friend's face or to understand a spoken sentence. These processes are automatic because they have been practiced thousands of times. The brain has learned that conscious oversight is unnecessary. The slow system, by contrast, is better suited for novelty. When a situation does not fit existing patterns, automatic responses become unreliable. This is when conscious thought becomes more active. You pause, you evaluate, you weigh options. This feels like decision-making, but it is often a response to uncertainty rather than a default mode of operation. The slow system is not always in control. It is more like a consultant called in when the usual procedures are insufficient. This explains why learning feels effortful. When you first acquire a new skill, the slow system does most of the work. You think about each step, you monitor mistakes, you correct yourself. Over time, as patterns become familiar, control shifts to the fast system. The skill becomes automatic. Driving a car, typing on a keyboard, or tying your shoes all follow this trajectory. What once required full attention eventually runs on autopilot. Importantly, this shift is not optional. It happens because the brain is always looking for ways to reduce cognitive load. Conscious attention is expensive. It consumes energy and limits multitasking. Automatic processing is cheaper and faster. Once a task is predictable enough, the brain hands it off. This handoff has consequences. One of them is that automatic thoughts can feel intrusive or out of sync with conscious intentions. You may know that a situation is safe, yet still feel anxious. You may intend to focus, yet find your attention drifting. You may decide to change a habit, yet repeat it anyway. These experiences are often interpreted as failures of willpower, but they are better understood as timing mismatches between the two systems. The fast system learned its responses through repetition and consequence. The slow system learned its goals through reflection and planning. When these learning histories differ, conflict arises. The fast system does not update instantly just because the slow system has reached a new conclusion. It requires new patterns, reinforced over time. Another important difference between the two systems lies in how they handle information. The slow system works serially. It processes one thing at a time. This is why multitasking feels difficult. You're not actually doing multiple complex tasks simultaneously. You're switching attention rapidly, which degrades performance. The fast system, however, works in parallel. It can process multiple streams of sensory input at once. It does not need to verbalize or sequence its operations. This parallel processing is why you can walk, maintain balance, listen to music, and navigate a familiar space without thinking about each component. It is also why you can feel overwhelmed when too many unfamiliar demands are placed on conscious attention at once. The slow system simply cannot keep up. There is also a difference in how these systems experience time. Automatic processes operate on the scale of milliseconds. They respond to changes almost immediately. Conscious thought unfolds more slowly. It requires sustained activation. This lag can create the illusion that thoughts come out of nowhere. In reality, the fast system has already done significant work before the slow system becomes aware of the result. This timing difference helps explain why people often confabulate reasons for their actions. When asked why they did something, they search for an explanation that fits their self-image and the available information. That explanation may feel sincere, but it may not reflect the actual causal chain. The fast system made the decision based on pattern recognition. The slow system provided the story afterward. This does not mean people are lying. It means introspection has limits. You can be honest and still inaccurate about the origins of your behavior. Awareness has access to outcomes, not to all the intermediate steps that produced them. Another distinction between the two systems is how they handle effort. The slow system is associated with a subjective sense of effort and fatigue. Thinking hard feels like work. The fast system does not produce this sensation. Its operations are not accompanied by a feeling of exertion, even though they may be metabolically demanding. This difference shapes motivation. People tend to avoid tasks that heavily engage the slow system, especially when tired or stressed. Stress itself shifts the balance between these systems. Under pressure, the brain favors speed over flexibility. Automatic responses become more dominant. This can be useful in emergencies, where quick action matters more than careful reasoning. In less urgent situations, however, this shift can lead to rigid thinking, habitual reactions, and reduced self-control. The slow system is more sensitive to stress and more likely to disengage when resources are scarce. Sleep deprivation has a similar effect. When tired, people rely more on automatic processing. Impulse control weakens, attention narrows, emotional reactions become harder to regulate. This is not because values have changed, but because the slow system lacks the energy to intervene effectively. The fast system continues to operate because it must. It is tempting to frame this relationship as a battle, with conscious thought trying to override automatic impulses. That framing is misleading. The two systems are not adversaries. They are collaborators with different strengths. Problems arise not because one system exists, but because their roles are misunderstood. Conscious thought is not meant to micromanage every action. Automatic processing is not meant to handle complex ethical decisions. Each works best within its domain. Understanding this division also clarifies why advice alone rarely produces lasting change. Telling someone what they should do engages the slow system. It may even produce temporary motivation. But behaviour is largely driven by the fast system, which responds to cues, habits, and emotional associations. Without changes at that level, insight remains theoretical. This is also why repetition matters more than intention. Repeated behaviour teaches the fast system what to expect. Each repetition strengthens a pattern. Each deviation weakens it slightly. Over time, the balance shifts. The slow system can initiate change, but the fast system sustains it. Another consequence of the two-speed brain is that attention itself becomes a limited resource. The slow system can only focus on a narrow slice of experience. The fast system decides what enters that slice. It prioritizes stimuli based on relevance, novelty, and emotional significance. This means you do not choose what you notice as much as you might think. Attention is guided before awareness has a say. This guidance explains why certain thoughts keep returning. If the fast system flags something as important or unresolved, it will keep presenting it to consciousness. Worry, rumination, and intrusive thoughts are often attempts by automatic systems to resolve perceived threats or inconsistencies. The slow system experiences them as distractions, but from the fast system's perspective, they are unfinished business. The relationship between these systems also shapes identity. People tend to identify with their conscious thoughts because those thoughts are accessible and narratable. Automatic processes feel impersonal, even when they strongly influence behaviour. This can create a sense of internal division, as if part of the mind is acting against one's wishes. In reality, both systems are part of the same organism responding to different demands. As this exploration continues, attention will move toward how these two speeds interact in specific domains, such as habit formation, emotional learning, and decision-making. The distinction between conscious and automatic thought provides a foundation for understanding why change feels difficult, why insight is not always enough, and why the mind often seems to run ahead of awareness rather than following it. Once this foundation is in place, the patterns that shape daily life begin to look less mysterious and more mechanical, not in a cold sense, but in a way that makes their persistence easier to understand as they continue to operate beneath the surface. The subconscious does not wait for instruction. It does not pause to ask whether a lesson is useful, accurate, or fair. It learns continuously, automatically, and often without any involvement from conscious thought at all. This is one of its defining features, and it is also the reason it has such a lasting influence on behaviour. Learning at this level is not something you turn on or off. It is a background process that runs as long as the brain is alive and receiving input. To understand how this kind of learning works, it helps to let go of the idea that learning is always intentional. Most people associate learning with effort, attention, and deliberate practice. That kind of learning certainly exists, but it represents only a narrow slice of what the brain does. The subconscious learns in a different way. It learns by exposure, by repetition, by association, by outcomes. It does not require understanding. It does not require agreement. It only requires patterns. Every time something happens, the brain registers not just the event itself, but the context around it. What came before, what followed, what changed in the body, whether the outcome felt better or worse than expected. These signals are constantly being integrated even when you're not paying attention. Over time, they form expectations. Those expectations then shape future perception and behaviour. This process begins early. Long before language develops, the brain is already tracking regularities. Infants learn the rhythms of voices, the timing of care, the predictability of comfort, and the signals associated with distress. None of this is conceptual. There are no beliefs involved. There are only probabilities being adjusted. Does crying lead to relief? Does reaching out result in contact? Does unpredictability precede discomfort? The answers to these questions are learned through experience, not explanation. What makes subconscious learning so powerful is that it is outcome-driven rather than rule-driven. Conscious learning often involves rules. You're told what is correct. You memorize procedures. You apply logic. Subconscious learning does not work that way. It cares about what happens, not about what should happen. If a behavior consistently reduces discomfort, it becomes more likely to occur again. If it increases discomfort, it becomes less likely. The system does not evaluate the broader consequences. It evaluates immediate feedback. This is why habits form even when people know better. Knowledge does not erase learned associations. If checking a phone reduces boredom or anxiety, the brain registers that relief. Over time, the cue and the behavior become linked. The conscious mind may object later, but the association has already been strengthened. The subconscious does not consult intentions, it responds to reinforcement. Reinforcement does not have to be dramatic. Small changes in emotional state are enough. A slight sense of relief, a brief reduction in uncertainty, a moment of comfort. These signals are subtle, but they accumulate. The brain is highly sensitive to changes in internal state. It tracks what leads to improvement and what leads to deterioration, even when the differences are barely noticeable. This sensitivity explains why the subconscious can learn from experiences you barely remember. You may not recall a specific interaction, but your behavior changes afterward. You may not remember when a certain place started to feel uncomfortable, but you avoid it. Memory at this level is not about recall, it is about bias. The system tilts behavior based on past outcomes, without requiring conscious access to the details. Another important feature of subconscious learning is that it is context-specific. The brain does not store lessons in isolation. It links them to environments, bodily states, social cues, and internal conditions. A behavior that feels safe in one context may feel wrong in another. A response learned under stress may not activate when calm. This is why people can behave very differently depending on where they are, who they are with, or how they feel physically. Context also explains why change can be difficult to generalize. You may learn a new response in one setting and find it disappears in another. This is not resistance, it is specificity. The subconscious learned the association in one context and does not automatically apply it elsewhere. From its perspective, a different context is a different problem. The speed at which the subconscious learns is another key factor. It often learns faster from emotional experiences than from neutral ones. Strong emotions amplify learning signals. Fear, relief, shame, excitement, and surprise all increase the likelihood that an association will stick. This bias exists because emotional events often have survival relevance. The system is designed to prioritize them. This prioritization can be helpful or problematic depending on circumstances. A single frightening experience can teach avoidance that protects you from harm. It can also produce long-lasting fear that no longer matches reality. Because the subconscious prefers to avoid false negatives, it sometimes overlearns from negative outcomes. It would rather be overly cautious than underprepared. The subconscious also learns from observation, not just direct experience. Watching others react can shape expectations. Seeing fear can teach threat. Seeing calm can teach safety. This kind of learning does not require personal involvement. It relies on the brain's ability to simulate outcomes based on social information. Again, this happens without conscious decision. Importantly, the subconscious does not distinguish between intentional and unintentional learning. You may deliberately practice a skill, but you also absorb patterns from background noise, repeated routines, and emotional climates. Living in a consistently stressful environment teaches vigilance. Living in a predictable one teaches relaxation. These lessons are learned whether or not you endorse them. This brings up an uncomfortable reality. Many of the patterns that shape adult behavior were learned in situations where choice was limited. Children adapt to their environments because they must. The subconscious optimizes for survival within the available conditions. Strategies that were adaptive at one time may become maladaptive later. The system does not automatically discard them when circumstances change. Another reason subconscious learning is so persistent is that it does not rely on conscious memory. Forgetting an event does not erase its influence. If a pattern was reinforced enough, it continues to shape behavior even when the original cause is no longer accessible. This can create confusion. People may know that something is no longer relevant, yet still feel its pull. The mechanism behind this persistence lies in how neural pathways strengthen. Repetition increases efficiency. Signals that travel the same routes repeatedly become faster and more reliable. This is not metaphorical. Physical changes occur at synapses. Connections that are used more often become easier to activate. This is sometimes summarized as cells that fire together wire together. While simplified, the idea captures the essence of how experience shapes structure. Because of this, the subconscious does not change in response to isolated insight. Insight is a cognitive event. Structural change requires repeated activation of new patterns. This is why awareness can feel disconnected from behavior. You may understand a pattern intellectually while the underlying pathways remain unchanged. The system has not yet been given enough new data to revise its predictions. The subconscious also learns indirectly from bodily states. Hunger, fatigue, pain, and illness all influence learning. A behavior associated with relief during exhaustion may be learned differently than the same behavior when well rested. This is why stress can accelerate habit formation. Under strain, the system is more eager to lock in anything that reduces load. Sleep plays a role here as well. During sleep, especially deep and REM stages, the brain consolidates learning. It strengthens some connections and weakens others. This process is not selective in the way conscious planning is. It reflects what was most active and emotionally charged during waking hours. The subconscious continues learning even when you are not awake to witness it. One of the most important implications of all this is that the subconscious cannot be persuaded through argument. It does not respond to logic or reassurance alone. Telling yourself that something is safe does not automatically recalibrate systems that learned danger through experience. Words are not the currency it trades in. Exposure, consistency, and outcome are. This does not mean change is impossible. It means change follows different rules. To influence subconscious learning, the environment must change in a way the system can register. New patterns must be repeated. Old associations must be violated often enough to reduce their reliability. This takes time because the system is conservative. It updates gradually to avoid instability. Another implication is that the subconscious is always learning, even when no deliberate change is intended. This cuts both ways. Unhelpful patterns can be reinforced unintentionally. Helpful ones can be built quietly. What feels neutral to the conscious mind may still be informative to the automatic systems. Understanding that the subconscious learns without asking permission shifts how responsibility is framed. It moves the focus away from blame and toward mechanics. Patterns exist because they were learned. They persist because they have not yet been unlearned or replaced. Moral judgment does not accelerate this process. Conditions do. As attention moves forward, the next step is to look at one of the most visible products of this kind of learning: habits. Habits are not moral failings or signs of weakness. They are evidence of a system that learns quickly and prefers efficiency. Once their role is understood, the idea of changing them begins to look less like a battle of willpower and more like a process of retraining something that has been doing exactly what it was designed to do, just without ever asking whether you agreed with the lesson it absorbed along the way. Habits are one of the clearest places where the subconscious makes itself visible, even though most of the time we don't experience them as something active or intentional. A habit does not feel like a decision. It feels like something that simply happens. You find yourself doing it before you have a chance to weigh alternatives. In many cases, you only become aware of the habit after it has already begun, or even after it's finished. That sense of automaticity is not accidental. It is the defining feature of a habit, and it exists because the subconscious has taken over the task completely. At a basic level, a habit is a learned shortcut. It is the brain's way of saying, "This situation has occurred before, and last time this response worked well enough." Once that association is strong enough, the response is triggered with minimal involvement from conscious thought. This is not because the brain is trying to undermine you. It is because habits save energy. They reduce uncertainty. They free up mental resources for things that cannot yet be predicted. Think about how many actions you perform in a day without actively deciding to do them. Brushing your teeth, locking the door, checking your phone, adjusting your posture, following the same route through a familiar space. If you had to consciously decide each step, even simple days would be exhausting. Habits make life manageable by shifting repeated behaviors into the background. The subconscious handles this shift efficiently. When a behavior is repeated in a stable context and leads to a predictable outcome, the brain begins to link the context directly to the behavior. Over time, the link strengthens and the role of conscious oversight fades. Eventually, the cue alone is enough to trigger the action. The result feels like autopilot. This autopilot quality explains both why habits are useful and why they can be frustrating. Once established, they are remarkably resistant to change. That resistance is not stubbornness, it is reliability. From the brain's perspective, a habit represents a proven solution. Abandoning it would mean reintroducing uncertainty, which the system generally prefers to avoid. One common misunderstanding is that habits are driven primarily by repetition. Repetition matters, but it is not the whole story. What truly locks a habit in place is the outcome, specifically the internal outcome. The subconscious pays close attention to changes in emotional or physiological state. If a behavior reliably leads to relief, comfort, stimulation, or a sense of control, that effect becomes part of the habit loop. The behavior is reinforced not because it was repeated, but because it worked. This is why habits form more quickly under stress. When someone is tired, anxious, or overwhelmed, the system is especially sensitive to anything that reduces strain. A behavior that offers even brief relief becomes valuable. The subconscious does not evaluate long-term consequences in these moments. It prioritizes immediate stabilization. Over time, the relief becomes expected, and the habit becomes automatic. Habits are also highly specific to context. The subconscious does not store them as general rules, it stores them as responses to particular cues. Time of day, location, emotional state, social environment, and even body posture can all function as triggers. This is why habits can disappear on vacation and return immediately at home. The context changed, not the person. Because of this specificity, people often underestimate how many cues are involved in a habit. They may focus on the behavior itself while ignoring the conditions that activate it. The subconscious, however, is tracking those conditions constantly. When they align, the behavior is released. When they do not, it remains dormant. This is not a conscious process. It happens before awareness has time to intervene. Another important aspect of habits is that they are not inherently good or bad. The brain does not assign moral value to them. It assigns probability. A habit that looks self-destructive from a reflective standpoint may still be serving a function at the subconscious level. It may regulate emotion, manage boredom, or create a sense of predictability. Understanding that function does not mean endorsing the habit. It means recognizing why it persists. This perspective is important because it changes how habits are addressed. If a habit exists because it reliably produces a certain internal effect, simply removing the behavior without addressing the effect leaves a gap. The subconscious will look for another way to achieve the same outcome. This is why people often replace one habit with another rather than eliminating the pattern entirely. The system is not attached to the behavior itself, it is attached to the result. There is also a timing issue involved. Conscious awareness often arrives after the habit has already been initiated. You may suddenly realize you are halfway through a behavior you intended to avoid. This is not a failure of attention. It is a feature of how habits operate. Once triggered, they unfold quickly. Conscious thought lags behind because it operates on a slower timescale. This lag can create a sense of helplessness, as if habits are running the show while awareness watches from the sidelines. In reality, awareness still plays a role, but not at the moment of execution. Its influence is strongest before the trigger and after the outcome. It shapes the conditions under which habits are learned and reinforced, not the split-second decision to act. Another reason habits feel so entrenched is that they often operate below the level of memory. You may not remember when a habit began or why it formed. That does not weaken it. Habits are procedural, not narrative. They are stored as action patterns rather than stories. Forgetting the origin does not erase the pathway. This is also why explaining a habit to yourself does not necessarily change it. Understanding how a habit formed may be accurate and even insightful, but the subconscious does not update based on explanation. It updates based on experience. New patterns must be enacted in the same context that trigger the old ones, and they must lead to outcomes the system can register as preferable. Habits also interact with identity in subtle ways. Over time, repeated behaviors become associated with a sense of self. People begin to describe themselves in terms of their habits. I'm not a morning person. I always do this under stress. These statements feel descriptive, but they can also reinforce patterns by treating them as fixed traits rather than learned responses. The subconscious does not care about identity labels, but it does respond to consistency. If a behavior is repeated alongside a particular self-description, the association strengthens. The behavior feels more natural. Alternatives feel less accessible. This can make change feel like a threat to identity, even when the conscious mind wants it. Another complicating factor is that habits often stack. One automatic behavior triggers another, creating chains that run with little oversight. A cue leads to a behavior, which produces a state that becomes a cue for the next behavior. These chains can run for minutes or hours before awareness fully engages. Breaking them requires noticing earlier links, not just the final action. The role of reward in habit formation is often misunderstood. The reward does not have to be pleasure in the usual sense. It can be the removal of discomfort, the reduction of uncertainty, or the restoration of a familiar feeling. In many cases, the reward is subtle and negative in form. Something unpleasant stops. The subconscious is highly responsive to that change. Because habits are driven by prediction, they can persist even when the reward weakens. If the system expects relief and occasionally receives it, the pattern may continue. This is similar to how intermittent reinforcement strengthens learning. The uncertainty keeps the system engaged. The habit does not need to work every time to remain active. This is one reason why breaking habits can feel more difficult than forming them. The system is cautious about abandoning patterns that might still be useful. It requires repeated evidence that the old response no longer delivers its expected outcome. This evidence must be experienced, not reasoned. It is also important to recognize that not all habits are behavioral. Some are cognitive or emotional. Patterns of thought, interpretation, and self-talk can become habitual as well. Worry, self-criticism, and rumination often function like habits. They are triggered by specific cues and unfold automatically. The subconscious treats them like any other learned response. These internal habits are especially difficult to address because they feel like part of consciousness itself. Thoughts feel personal. When they repeat, it is easy to assume they reflect truth or intention. In reality, they are often the mental equivalent of muscle memory. They arise because they have been activated many times before. The autopilot nature of habits does not mean they are unchangeable. It means they change indirectly. The subconscious updates its habits when the environment changes in a consistent way. This includes the external environment and the internal one. Sleep, stress, nutrition, and emotional context all influence how strongly habits are expressed. For example, a habit that feels overwhelming when tired may feel weaker when rested. This is not coincidence. The system's thresholds shift based on available resources. When energy is low, the brain relies more heavily on automation. When energy is higher, there is more room for conscious intervention. This explains why people often struggle with habits at night or under pressure, even when they manage them well at other times. The underlying patterns have not changed. The balance between systems has. Recognizing this can reduce unnecessary self-blame and redirect attention toward conditions rather than character. Another important point is that habits are not removed by force. Suppression can work temporarily, but it does not teach the subconscious a new response. It only blocks the old one. When suppression is lifted, the habit returns, often with greater intensity. The system interprets suppression as instability, not as learning. Change happens when the subconscious learns a different prediction, when the same cue leads to a different behavior and a tolerable or improved outcome, the system updates. This process is slow because the brain values reliability. A single exception is treated as noise. A pattern of exceptions is treated as information. Understanding habits as the subconscious on autopilot reframes the experience of feeling stuck. The system is not broken. It is doing what it was designed to do. It learned something once and it continues to apply that lesson. The work of change lies not in arguing with the system, but in teaching it something new through consistent experience. As attention moves forward, the focus will shift from habits themselves to the emotional systems that often drive them. Many habits exist not for their own sake, but because they regulate feeling. To understand why certain behaviors persist so strongly, it becomes necessary to look at how emotion enters the picture before conscious reasoning has a chance to weigh in, shaping action long before it feels like a choice. Emotion does not arrive as a reaction to thought. It arrives as a condition that shapes thought before it begins. This ordering is easy to miss because consciousness experiences emotion and reasoning as intertwined. But beneath awareness, they are not equals. Emotion comes first because it has to. Long before the brain was capable of reflection, language, or planning, it needed a way to evaluate situations quickly and bias action in useful directions. Emotion evolved to do exactly that. It is not decoration layered onto thinking. It is the foundation that thinking rests on. From a biological perspective, emotion is a signaling system. It translates complex internal and external information into a manageable set of states that guide behavior, safe or unsafe, rewarding or unrewarding, familiar or uncertain. These states are not conclusions reached after analysis. They are rapid assessments generated by neural circuits that prioritize speed over detail. By the time you consciously register how you feel, those circuits have already influenced attention, memory access, muscle readiness, and decision thresholds. This is why feelings often seem to appear out of nowhere. You walk into a room and feel tense without knowing why. You read a message and feel irritation before interpreting the words. You consider an option and feel resistance even though it makes sense on paper. These reactions are not irrational interruptions. They are outputs of systems that evaluated the situation faster than conscious thought could engage. The brain structures most involved in emotional processing are positioned to act early. Regions responsible for detecting threat, reward, and relevance receive sensory input quickly and send signals widely. They influence how incoming information is processed and how the body prepares to respond. This happens before detailed interpretation. In effect, emotion sets the stage. Reason enters after the lighting has already been chosen. One way to understand this is to think of emotion as a prioritization mechanism. The world presents far more information than the brain can process consciously. Something has to decide what matters. Emotion fills that role. It flags certain stimuli as important and suppresses others. This is not a neutral process. It is shaped by past experience, biological needs, and current state. What feels important to you right now may not feel important later, not because the facts changed, but because the internal context did. This prioritization affects perception itself. You do not see the world as it is in some objective sense. You see a version filtered through emotional relevance. When anxious, ambiguous cues lean toward threat. When calm, the same cues may go unnoticed. Emotion tunes the sensitivity of perception. It does not wait for reasoning to approve its settings. Because of this, reason often operates downstream of emotion rather than above it. Conscious thought frequently serves to justify or explain choices that were already biased by feeling. This does not mean reasoning is useless or dishonest. It means it is constrained. It works within boundaries set by earlier evaluations. This ordering has been demonstrated repeatedly in research. When emotional processing is disrupted, decision-making suffers even when reasoning ability remains intact. People can explain options logically yet struggle to choose. Without emotional input, nothing stands out as preferable. This reveals something counterintuitive. Emotion is not the enemy of rationality. It is a prerequisite for it. Without feelings, reason has no weighting system. Emotion also influences memory formation. Events associated with strong emotion are remembered differently from neutral ones. They are encoded more robustly, retrieved more easily, and often feel more significant. This is not an accident. The subconscious treats emotionally charged information as more relevant for future prediction. It wants those patterns readily available. This emotional tagging shapes learning. A single emotionally intense experience can outweigh many neutral ones. This is why fear-based learning is so fast. A painful or frightening outcome teaches avoidance quickly because the system treats the information as high priority. Reason may later argue that the danger is gone, but the emotional association remains until it is overwritten by new experience. Importantly, emotion does not have to be extreme to exert influence. Mild unease, slight anticipation, or subtle comfort can all bias behavior. These low-level feelings often go unnoticed because they do not demand attention. Yet they guide countless small decisions throughout the day. What you choose to engage with, what you postpone, what you avoid without explanation. These choices feel personal, but they are often driven by micro-adjustments in emotional state. Another reason emotion comes first is speed. Emotional systems operate faster than conscious reasoning. They rely on pattern matching rather than analysis. This makes them efficient in familiar situations but less flexible in novel ones. When circumstances change faster than the emotional learning updates, feelings can lag behind reality. This lag is a common source of internal conflict. For example, you may know intellectually that a situation is safe, yet still feel anxious. The reasoning system has updated, the emotional system has not. From the subconscious perspective, the old prediction has not been disproven enough times to be discarded. Until that happens, the feeling persists. Reason alone cannot force the update because it does not provide the type of evidence the emotional system uses. This mismatch often leads people to judge their emotions harshly. They interpret unwanted feelings as failures of character or insight. In reality, the system is behaving consistently. It learned something once and is still acting on that information. Emotional reactions are not statements of belief. They are expressions of learned expectation. Emotion also interacts with the body in direct ways. Changes in heart rate, muscle tension, breathing, and hormone release are part of emotional responses, not consequences of them. These bodily changes feed back into the brain, reinforcing the feeling. This loop operates largely outside awareness. By the time a feeling becomes conscious, the body is already involved. This bodily involvement explains why trying to think your way out of a feeling often fails. The signal is not purely cognitive, it is physiological. The body is already sending information that supports the emotional state. Without addressing that level, reasoning remains abstract. It also explains why physical states influence mood so strongly. Lack of sleep, hunger, illness, or pain can all bias emotional processing. When the body is under strain, emotional thresholds shift. Irritation comes more easily. Motivation drops. Threat feels closer. These changes do not require conscious interpretation. They happen because emotional systems integrate bodily signals automatically. Another important aspect of emotion-first processing is its role in social interaction. Humans are deeply social organisms. Rapid emotional evaluation of others was essential long before language allowed explicit negotiation. Tone of voice, facial expression, posture, and timing all convey information that is processed emotionally before it is interpreted consciously. You often feel what someone means before you understand what they say. This rapid evaluation supports coordination and bonding, but it also creates bias. First impressions form quickly and can persist even when contradicted by later information. The emotional system tends to trust its initial assessment. Updating requires repeated exposure and consistent counter-evidence. Again, speed is prioritized over accuracy. Emotion also shapes moral judgment. People often believe they arrive at moral conclusions through reasoning. In practice, emotional reactions guide judgment first, and reasoning constructs justification afterward. This has been shown across cultures and contexts. When emotional response is altered, moral conclusions often change even when facts remain constant. This does not mean morality is arbitrary. It means it is grounded in emotional systems that evolved to support cooperation, fairness, and harm avoidance. Reason helps articulate and refine these instincts, but it does not generate them from scratch. Another consequence of emotion coming first is that it influences what information is even considered. When something feels threatening, the mind searches for confirming evidence. When something feels rewarding, flaws are overlooked. This is not deliberate distortion, it is selective attention guided by emotion. The subconscious filters reality before the conscious mind begins evaluating it. This filtering can create self-reinforcing loops. If you feel anxious, you notice more signs of danger. Noticing danger increases anxiety. The loop continues until something interrupts it. Reason can help identify the pattern, but the loop itself operates at the emotional level. The same mechanism can support positive states. When you feel safe, attention broadens. You notice opportunities. Exploration feels possible. Emotion sets the parameters within which reason operates. It does not dictate conclusions, but it constrains the search space. One of the most important implications of all this is that emotional responses are not obstacles to be removed. They are information, sometimes outdated information, sometimes incomplete, but information nonetheless. Ignoring it or suppressing it does not make it disappear. It simply removes conscious access while the influence continues. This perspective shifts how emotional regulation is understood. Regulation does not mean eliminating feelings. It means changing how they are generated, interpreted, and reinforced. This often involves working indirectly through environment, behavior, and bodily state, rather than through argument. Emotion-first processing also explains why people can make decisions they later regret, even when they knew better at the time. Under certain emotional states, reasoning capacity narrows. Short-term priorities dominate. This is not a moral failure, it is a predictable shift in system balance. Stress, in particular, amplifies emotion-first control. Under stress, the brain favors speed and habit. Automatic responses dominate. The reasoning system is still present, but its influence is reduced. This is why people revert to old patterns under pressure, even after significant growth. The system is not reverting to a true self. It is reverting to the most practiced responses under similar conditions. Understanding that feelings come first does not mean surrendering to them. It means recognizing their role in shaping experience. Reason works best when it understands the conditions under which it operates. When emotional context is acknowledged rather than ignored, reasoning becomes more effective, not less. As this exploration continues, the focus will move toward how emotion interacts with memory and prediction, shaping not just immediate reactions, but long-term expectations about the world and the self. The more clearly this interaction is understood, the easier it becomes to see why the mind often seems to decide before you're aware that a decision is being made, carrying momentum forward into the next moment without ever stopping to ask whether you agree. Memory is often imagined as a kind of mental archive, a place where experiences are stored and later retrieved when needed. That image is convenient, but it hides more than it explains. Memory is not a single system, and it is not primarily designed to preserve the past accurately. Its main function is to guide the future. Much of what memory does happens outside awareness, shaping perception, emotion, and behavior without ever presenting itself as a recollection. This is what makes memory beneath awareness so influential. It works quietly, continuously, and without asking whether you would like to remember anything at all. When people think about memory, they usually think about recall, names, dates, events, stories, the moments you can bring to mind and describe. But this kind of memory is only one part of a much larger system. It is also the smallest part in terms of daily influence. Beneath it lies a vast network of learned associations, emotional tags, motor patterns, and expectations that never become conscious memories, yet still determine how situations feel and how responses unfold. From a biological standpoint, memory is change. Every experience slightly alters the brain. Connections strengthen or weaken. Timing shifts. Sensitivity adjusts. These changes accumulate whether or not you later remember the event that caused them. Forgetting an experience does not undo its impact. If the experience shaped behavior or expectation, the memory is still active, just not accessible as a story. This is why people can react strongly to situations they cannot explain. A place may feel uncomfortable without any remembered reason. A tone of voice may provoke tension without recalling a similar past interaction. The memory involved is not narrative, it is associative. The brain has linked certain cues to certain outcomes, and it responds accordingly. Conscious awareness receives the output, not the file. One of the most important distinctions here is between declarative memory and non-declarative memory. Declarative memory includes facts and events you can consciously recall. Non-declarative memory includes skills, habits, conditioning, and emotional associations. The latter operates almost entirely beneath awareness. You do not remember how you learned to recognize a face, to understand sarcasm, or to feel uneasy in certain social situations. You simply do. Non-declarative memory is also more durable in many ways. You may forget the details of learning to ride a bike, but the skill remains. You may forget when a fear began, but the reaction persists. This durability exists because these memories are distributed across systems that are constantly active. They are not retrieved occasionally. They are expressed continuously. Emotional memory is a particularly powerful form of non-declarative memory. When an experience carries emotional weight, the brain prioritizes its storage. The emotional component acts as a signal that the information is relevant for future prediction. This does not require conscious labeling. The emotional response itself modifies how the experience is encoded. This explains why emotionally charged memories feel different. They are not just remembered, they are re-experienced to some degree. The bodily sensations, the tension, the urgency may return even when the context is gone. The brain does this because, from its perspective, the safest assumption is that what mattered once may matter again. Importantly, emotional memory does not preserve accuracy. It preserves significance. Details may blur or distort over time, but the emotional tone often remains. This can create a mismatch between what you know and what you feel. You may know that something is unlikely, but still react as if it were imminent. The memory system is not concerned with probability. It is concerned with preparedness. Memory beneath awareness also plays a central role in shaping expectations. The brain constantly predicts what will happen next based on past patterns. These predictions are not conscious guesses. They are automatic adjustments to perception and readiness. When you enter a familiar situation, your brain has already prepared a likely script. You feel at ease or alert before anything actually happens. These predictions influence how new information is interpreted. If an outcome matches expectation, it reinforces the underlying memory. If it contradicts expectation, the system has to decide whether to update. Updating requires repeated contradiction. A single exception is often dismissed. This conservatism keeps behavior stable, but it also allows outdated memories to continue influencing responses. This dynamic is especially visible in social contexts. Past interactions shape how you anticipate others will behave. Tone, timing, and facial expressions are interpreted through learned templates. These templates operate automatically. You do not consciously decide how to interpret a look or a pause. The meaning arrives prepackaged. When these interpretations are accurate, social interaction feels smooth. When they are inaccurate, misunderstandings arise. Yet even then, the underlying memory does not change immediately. The system assumes continuity unless proven otherwise over time. This is why first impressions are powerful and difficult to reverse. Another layer of memory beneath awareness involves the body itself. The body remembers patterns of tension, movement, and physiological response. Chronic stress can teach the body to remain on high alert. Repeated relaxation can teach it to settle more easily. These patterns are not stored as thoughts. They are stored as tendencies in muscle tone, breathing, and autonomic regulation. This bodily memory feeds back into emotional experience. A tense body sends signals of threat or effort. A relaxed body sends signals of safety. These signals influence mood and perception without requiring interpretation. The subconscious integrates them automatically. Sleep plays a critical role in maintaining and updating memory beneath awareness. During sleep, especially deep sleep and REM sleep, the brain reorganizes information. It strengthens some connections and weakens others. This process is not random. It reflects what was most active and emotionally salient during waking hours. Because of this, what you repeatedly think about or emotionally engage with tends to shape memory consolidation. The subconscious continues learning while you sleep. This is why unresolved concerns often feel different after rest. The system has had time to integrate or reweight information. It is also why lack of sleep can distort memory. Without adequate consolidation, emotional memories may remain raw and poorly integrated. Reactivity increases. The boundary between past and present blurs. Situations feel more intense than they otherwise would because the memory system has not had the chance to recalibrate. Another important feature of memory beneath awareness is that it does not respect chronology. Memories are not stored in a neat timeline. They are organized by association. Similar cues activate similar networks regardless of when the original experience occurred. This is why something small in the present can evoke a strong reaction rooted in a distant past. This associative organization is efficient for prediction, but confusing for introspection. The conscious mind expects reasons to be recent and linear. When they are not, the reaction feels mysterious or disproportionate. In reality, the system is responding to pattern similarity, not to narrative relevance. Memory beneath awareness also interacts with identity. Over time, repeated patterns of response become familiar. They feel like how I am. These patterns influence self-description and expectation. You may come to see yourself as anxious, reserved, impulsive, or cautious based on the consistency of these automatic responses. The identity label emerges after the pattern, not before. This can create a sense of permanence. If a pattern has been active for years, it feels intrinsic. But from a learning perspective, it is still a memory-based response. It persists because it has not been consistently challenged by new experiences in the same context that formed it. Another subtle aspect of memory beneath awareness is its role in attention. The brain does not scan the environment evenly. It biases attention toward what has mattered before. If a certain type of cue has been associated with threat or reward, it will stand out. This bias operates before conscious choice. This is why people differ in what they notice. Two people can be in the same situation and experience it very differently. Their memory systems are tuning attention based on different histories. Neither perception is neutral. Each is informed by past learning. Memory beneath awareness also influences decision-making by shaping what options feel available. Some choices feel easy to consider. Others feel invisible or unthinkable. This is not because they are logically impossible, but because the system has no positive history with them. Without an associated sense of safety or reward, the option does not present itself as viable. This is particularly relevant when people try to change long-standing patterns. New behaviors feel unnatural not because they are wrong, but because the memory system has not yet linked them to acceptable outcomes. The discomfort is not a signal of failure, it is a signal of unfamiliarity. Another point often overlooked is that memory beneath awareness is not passive, it is updated constantly. Every interaction, every emotional shift, every outcome provides data. The system is always adjusting probabilities. However, these adjustments are incremental. Large shifts require sustained new input. This is why single insights, even powerful ones, often do not lead to lasting change. Insight may alter conscious understanding, but it does not immediately rewrite associative memory. That requires repetition in the relevant context. The memory system needs to experience the new pattern enough times to trust it. It is also why inconsistency slows change. If a new behavior sometimes leads to a better outcome and sometimes to a worse one, the system hesitates. It favors the older, more reliable pattern. Reliability matters more than novelty. Memory beneath awareness can also maintain emotional states over time. If a certain emotional tone has been present frequently, the system may begin to treat it as baseline. This can make calm feel unfamiliar or even uncomfortable. The absence of a familiar emotional state can be interpreted as a problem, even when it is healthier. This phenomenon helps explain why people sometimes return to stressful situations or recreate familiar conflicts. The memory system is not seeking pain, it is seeking predictability. Familiar patterns feel safer than unknown ones, even if they are unpleasant. Understanding memory beneath awareness changes how responsibility and change are framed. Patterns are not evidence of weakness or resistance. They are evidence of learning. The system is doing what it was trained to do. Training can be updated, but not through argument or force. As attention moves forward, the next step is to examine how these memory systems feed into prediction more explicitly, shaping behavior before conscious choice ever appears. The mind does not wait to decide and then act. It predicts, prepares, and biases action continuously, using memory not as a record of the past, but as a guide for what it expects to happen next, carrying those expectations forward into each new moment. The brain does not wait for information to arrive before it begins responding. It anticipates, it guesses, it prepares for what it expects to happen next, and then it adjusts only if reality forces it to. This predictive quality is not a secondary feature layered on top of thinking. It is the core operating principle of the nervous system. Long before a decision feels like a decision, the brain has already been running forecasts based on memory, context, and internal state. What you experience as choice often arrives after those forecasts have narrowed the field. From the outside, it might seem as though perception works in a simple sequence. Something happens, you notice it, you think about it, and then you respond. Inside the brain, the order is different. The brain is constantly generating expectations about incoming sensory data. These expectations shape what you notice, how you interpret it, and how quickly you react. When the incoming data matches the prediction, the experience feels smooth and unremarkable. When it does not, attention is drawn and conscious thought becomes more involved. This predictive process exists because reacting only after something happens is too slow. In a changing environment, waiting for certainty is costly. The brain solves this by using past experience to simulate the immediate future. It prepares actions, emotional responses, and interpretations in advance. Most of the time, this works well enough. The world is structured. Patterns repeat. Prediction saves time and energy. You can see this clearly in perception. Vision, for example, is not a passive recording of light hitting the eyes. The brain actively predicts what it is about to see based on context and prior exposure. This is why optical illusions work. The brain fills in gaps, smooths over ambiguity, and assumes continuity. You do not see raw data, you see a best guess. The same principle applies to sound. When listening to speech, the brain predicts upcoming words and sounds. This is why you can understand someone even in a noisy environment. Missing information is filled in automatically. You're not decoding each sound independently. You're matching incoming signals to predicted patterns. Prediction also governs movement. When you reach for an object, your brain predicts where your hand will be and adjusts muscle activation accordingly. This happens continuously. You do not consciously correct every movement. The system forecasts outcomes and fine-tunes actions before feedback arrives. If it waited for feedback alone, movement would be clumsy and slow. This constant prediction extends into cognition and decision-making. Before you consciously weigh options, the brain has already assigned them emotional and motivational value. Some options feel attractive, others feel aversive, others barely register at all. These feelings are not conclusions. They are predictions about what choosing each option would lead to based on prior experience. This is why some decisions feel easy and others feel paralyzing. When the predictive system strongly favors one outcome, conscious deliberation feels unnecessary. When predictions conflict or are uncertain, conscious thought is recruited to help resolve the ambiguity. The feeling of thinking hard often signals that prediction alone was insufficient. Importantly, these predictions are not always accurate. They are educated guesses shaped by past patterns. When circumstances change, predictions can lag behind reality. This is a feature of a system that prioritizes stability. Updating predictions too quickly would create chaos. The brain prefers to be slightly wrong, but consistent rather than constantly revising its expectations. This conservatism explains why people can persist in outdated patterns even when they no longer serve them. The predictive system has learned that a certain response usually leads to a certain outcome. Until it accumulates enough evidence to the contrary, it continues to act as if that prediction is valid. Conscious insight does not override this process instantly, because insight is not the currency the system uses. The predictive brain also explains why decisions often feel made before you are aware of making them. Studies have shown that neural activity associated with choice can be detected before people report having consciously decided. This does not mean free will is an illusion in a simple sense. It means that the brain prepares actions before awareness catches up. Consciousness experiences the final selection, not the full build-up. From the brain's perspective, this makes sense. Preparing multiple possible actions in advance allows for faster response. When the moment comes, the system selects the option with the highest predicted value. Conscious awareness receives the result as an intention. The process feels unified, but it was distributed and gradual. Prediction also plays a central role in emotion. Emotional states reflect predictions about what is likely to happen and how manageable it will be. Anxiety, for example, is not just fear of a specific threat. It is a state of heightened prediction error. The system expects something to go wrong, but lacks a clear target. The body prepares for action without knowing what action will be required. Confidence, by contrast, reflects a sense that predictions are reliable. When the system expects manageable outcomes, emotional tone shifts accordingly. This does not require conscious optimism. It emerges from a repeated experience of predictability and control. One of the most important jobs of the predictive brain is minimizing surprise. Surprise is metabolically expensive. It requires rapid updating, reallocation of attention, and potential changes in behavior. The brain works to reduce surprise by improving its predictions. Learning at a fundamental level is the process of reducing prediction error over time. When something unexpected happens, the brain has two options. It can update its model of the world, or it can reinterpret the event to fit the existing model. Often, it chooses the second option first. This is not dishonesty, it is efficiency. If every anomaly forced a complete revision, the system would be unstable. Only repeated, reliable violations trigger deeper change. This tendency explains why beliefs and expectations can persist despite contradictory evidence. The predictive system is biased toward preserving its existing model unless the cost of doing so becomes too high. Conscious reasoning may notice inconsistencies, but the underlying predictions update more slowly. Prediction also shapes attention. The brain allocates attention to what it expects to be informative. If something fits the prediction, it is processed with minimal effort. If it violates expectation, attention increases. This is why novelty grabs attention. It signals a mismatch between prediction and reality. This mechanism can also sustain worry and rumination. If the predictive system flags a potential problem as unresolved, it keeps presenting related thoughts to consciousness. The repetition is not meant to annoy. It is an attempt to resolve uncertainty. The system is seeking a prediction that feels reliable. However, when the uncertainty is abstract or uncontrollable, this loop can persist without resolution. Conscious thought experiences this as repetitive thinking. The predictive system experiences it as unfinished business. The predictive nature of the brain also explains why people often feel compelled to act even when waiting would be wiser. Action reduces uncertainty. Doing something, even if imperfect, provides feedback. Inaction leaves predictions untested. For the subconscious, feedback is valuable. This is why people sometimes rush decisions under uncertainty. The system prefers information over ambiguity. Prediction operates not just on external events, but on internal states. The brain predicts how actions will make you feel. If an action is expected to reduce discomfort, it becomes more attractive. This is why habits are so closely tied to prediction. A habit exists because the system predicts a certain outcome based on past repetitions. This prediction does not have to be accurate every time. It only needs to be good enough often enough. Occasional failure does not erase the expectation. In fact, intermittent reinforcement can strengthen it. The uncertainty keeps the prediction active. Prediction also shapes identity. Over time, the brain predicts how you will respond in certain situations. These predictions become part of how you see yourself. You come to expect your own reactions. When you behave differently, it can feel unsettling. Not because it is wrong, but because it violates internal prediction. This internal prediction explains why change can feel uncomfortable, even when it is positive. The system does not yet trust the new pattern. Familiar discomfort may feel safer than unfamiliar calm. The predictive brain values reliability over comfort. Another layer of prediction involves social interaction. The brain predicts how others will respond based on past encounters. Tone, timing, and context are used to forecast reactions. These predictions guide how you speak, what you reveal, and what you withhold. Much of social behavior unfolds automatically based on these forecasts. When predictions about others are accurate, interaction feels effortless. When they are not, social friction arises. Misunderstandings often occur not because people intend harm, but because their predictive models differ. Each person is responding to a different set of expectations. Prediction also influences moral and value-based decisions. Before conscious reasoning weighs principles, the brain predicts social consequences: approval, disapproval, inclusion, exclusion. These predictions shape what feels acceptable or risky. Moral reasoning often articulates what prediction has already favoured. It is important to note that prediction is not prophecy. The brain does not know the future. It simulates likely outcomes based on past data. When the environment changes rapidly, prediction accuracy suffers. This is when anxiety, confusion, and rigid behaviour increase. The system struggles to keep up. In modern life, environments change faster than they did for most of human history. Social norms shift. Technology evolves. Roles blur. The predictive brain, optimized for stability, can lag behind. This mismatch contributes to stress and a sense of being overwhelmed. The system is constantly updating models that become outdated quickly. Understanding the brain as a prediction engine reframes the experience of choice. Decisions are not created from nothing in the moment. They emerge from a field of expectations, biases, and emotional valuations already in motion. Conscious thought participates, but it does not start from zero. This does not mean change is impossible. It means change requires altering predictions, not just intentions. Predictions change through experience. When new outcomes are repeatedly observed in relevant contexts, the system updates. This is why sustained change feels gradual. The predictive model is being rewritten piece by piece. As attention continues forward, the focus will move toward one of the strongest forces shaping prediction: fear and safety. These ancient programs heavily bias what the brain expects and how it prepares. To understand why some predictions feel so compelling and so resistant to reason, it becomes necessary to look at how survival-oriented systems learn to prioritize protection long before conscious decision-making ever had a voice. Fear did not evolve to make life uncomfortable. It evolved to keep organisms alive in environments where hesitation could be fatal. Long before language, before culture, before reflective thought, nervous systems needed a way to rapidly distinguish between what was safe and what was not. Fear emerged as part of that solution. It is not a flaw layered onto an otherwise rational mind. It is one of the oldest operating systems still running inside the human brain, and it continues to shape behaviour whether we acknowledge it or not. At its core, fear is a prediction about danger. It is the brain's way of saying that something in the current situation resembles a pattern that once led to harm. That prediction does not need to be precise. It does not need to be fair. It only needs to be fast. From an evolutionary standpoint, reacting to a false alarm is far less costly than ignoring a real threat. This imbalance explains why fear systems tend to err on the side of caution, and why they are so resistant to reassurance. The structures most involved in fear processing are among the most ancient in the brain. They receive sensory input quickly and send signals widely. Their job is not to analyze, it is to initiate preparation. When a potential threat is detected, these systems trigger changes throughout the body. Heart rate increases, muscles tense, attention narrows, stress hormones are released. All of this happens before conscious awareness has time to assess the situation. By the time you feel afraid, your body's already acting as if danger is present. Conscious thought enters a system that has been preloaded with urgency. This ordering is not accidental. In environments where predators, injury, or social exclusion could mean death, waiting for careful reasoning would have been disastrous. The survival program acts first and asks questions later, if at all. These ancient systems do not distinguish between physical and psychological threat in the way modern humans do. Social rejection, uncertainty, and loss of control can activate the same pathways that once responded to predators. From the brain's perspective, exclusion from a group once meant reduced access to resources and protection. That made it dangerous. The emotional response persists even though the context has changed. This is why fear can be triggered by things that are not objectively dangerous. Public speaking, conflict, uncertainty about the future, or even silence can activate survival responses. The system is responding to pattern similarity, not to rational assessment. It recognizes cues that resemble past threats and reacts accordingly. Safety, in this context, is not simply the absence of danger. It is the presence of predictability. The survival system is constantly asking whether the environment is manageable. When outcomes feel predictable, the system relaxes. When they feel uncertain, vigilance increases. This is why fear often intensifies in ambiguous situations. The lack of clear information makes prediction difficult. Predictability matters more than comfort. A familiar, stressful environment can feel safer than an unfamiliar, calm one. The brain knows what to expect in the former. It does not in the latter. This preference can lead people to remain in situations that are objectively harmful because they are predictable. The survival system values reliability over well-being. Fear learning is particularly fast and persistent. A single experience associated with intense threat can create a lasting association. This is because the emotional weight amplifies learning signals. The system treats the information as high priority. It does not wait to see if the event repeats. It assumes the pattern is important enough to remember immediately. Once learned, fear responses are slow to extinguish. Repeated exposure without harm is required to update the prediction. Even then, the old association does not disappear completely. It is inhibited rather than erased. Under stress, fatigue, or uncertainty, the original response can re-emerge. This is why people can feel as though they have gone backward after making progress. The underlying program was never deleted. It was simply overridden temporarily. Fear also biases attention strongly. When the survival system is active, the brain scans for additional signs of threat. Neutral cues are interpreted pessimistically. Ambiguity is resolved in the direction of danger. This bias is not a conscious choice. It is a shift in processing thresholds. The system becomes more sensitive to potential problems. This attentional bias creates feedback loops. Increased vigilance leads to noticing more potential threats. Noticing more threats reinforces the sense of danger. The loop continues until something interrupts it. Reason alone often cannot do this because the loop operates at the level of perception and bodily state, not belief. Another important feature of fear systems is their relationship to control. Situations where action feels possible are experienced differently from situations where it does not. When the brain believes it has options, fear is modulated. When it believes it is trapped or helpless, fear intensifies. This is why loss of control is such a powerful trigger. Learned helplessness is one example of how survival programs adapt. When repeated efforts to influence outcomes fail, the system reduces motivation to act. This is not laziness, it is conservation. Acting without effect wastes energy and increases risk. The system learns that inaction is safer. Unfortunately, this learning can persist even when circumstances change. Fear also interacts with memory in specific ways. Memories associated with threat are retrieved more easily. They feel more vivid. They influence prediction disproportionately. This weighting exists because missing a threat is more costly than overestimating one. The system prefers to be prepared. This bias means that negative experiences can outweigh positive ones in shaping expectation. A series of neutral or mildly positive outcomes may not counteract a single intense negative event. The survival system is tuned to prioritize worst-case scenarios. This tuning was adaptive in harsh environments. In modern life, it can create chronic anxiety. It is important to understand that fear responses are not judgments. They do not reflect values or intentions. Feeling afraid does not mean something is wrong with you, or that you believe something terrible will happen. It means a survival program has been activated based on pattern recognition. Treating fear as information rather than as a verdict changes how it is handled. Safety signals are just as important as threat signals, but they are often less obvious. Consistency, warmth, clear communication, and predictable outcomes all signal safety. When these signals are present repeatedly, the survival system gradually relaxes. This relaxation does not happen instantly because the system is conservative. It requires evidence over time. The body plays a central role in signaling safety. Slow breathing, relaxed posture, and steady movement send feedback to the brain that conditions are manageable. These signals influence emotional state without requiring conscious interpretation. This is why physical interventions can affect fear even when thoughts do not change. Social safety is particularly powerful. Humans evolved in groups. The presence of trusted others reduces vigilance. Signals of acceptance and support modulate fear responses. Conversely, social uncertainty amplifies them. This sensitivity persists even when people consciously value independence. The survival system operates on older rules. Fear also shapes moral and ethical behavior. Avoidance of punishment, loss of status, or exclusion can guide choices before principles are consciously weighed. This does not mean morality is fear-based, but fear contributes to how norms are enforced and internalized. Social fear once had direct survival implications. One of the most challenging aspects of fear is that it can become decoupled from present reality. The system may respond to internal cues such as thoughts, memories, or bodily sensations as if they were external threats. Panic attacks are one example. The body enters a state of emergency without an external trigger. The survival system has misinterpreted internal signals as danger. When this happens, reassurance often fails. Telling yourself you are safe does not automatically calm the system, because the signal originated below awareness. The body is already mobilized. The system requires evidence at the level it understands. This usually involves repeated experiences of safety, while the feared state is present. Another complicating factor is that fear can be reinforced unintentionally. Avoidance reduces fear in the short term. That reduction is registered as relief. Relief reinforces avoidance. Over time, the range of avoided situations can expand. The system learns that avoidance works. The long-term cost is not considered. This does not mean avoidance is always wrong. Sometimes it is appropriate. The problem arises when avoidance becomes the default response to uncertainty. The survival system does not distinguish between adaptive and maladaptive avoidance. It distinguishes between relief and distress. Fear programs also interact with habits. Under threat, the brain relies more heavily on automatic behavior. This makes sense. Habitual responses are fast and reliable. Under pressure, creativity and flexibility decrease. This is why people revert to old patterns under stress. The system is prioritizing survival, not growth. Understanding fear as an ancient survival program reframes many modern struggles. Anxiety, avoidance, and hypervigilance are not signs of weakness. They are signs of a system doing its job too well in an environment very different from the one it evolved in. The rules have not changed, even though the context has. This perspective also clarifies why fear cannot be eliminated through insight alone. The system does not respond to explanation. It responds to experience. Safety must be demonstrated repeatedly in the presence of what was once threatening. Over time, predictions update. The process is slow because the cost of updating incorrectly is high. It is also important to note that fear systems do not operate in isolation. They interact with reward systems, habit systems, and social learning. Fear can suppress curiosity. It can narrow attention. It can override long-term goals. But when safety increases, these other systems re-engage. Exploration becomes possible again. As attention moves forward, the next step is to look more closely at how these ancient programs interact with the body itself. Fear is not just a feeling. it is a whole body state. Understanding how the subconscious communicates through physical sensation, tension, and physiology provides further insight into why thoughts alone rarely change how fear feels, and why the body often reacts first, carrying the mind along with it into the next moment. The subconscious does not live only in the brain, it is expressed through the body constantly, quietly shaping posture, breathing, muscle tone, heart rate, digestion, and countless other processes that rarely enter conscious awareness. When people talk about listening to the body, they're often pointing, without realizing it, to the way subconscious processes communicate through physical sensation long before thoughts form. The body is not just reacting to the mind, it is part of the mind's operating system. From a biological perspective, this makes sense. The nervous system evolved as a way to coordinate action across the entire organism. The brain did not develop as a detached command center issuing instructions to a passive body. It developed as part of an integrated network in constant feedback with muscles, organs, and sensory systems. Much of what the subconscious does is manage this network automatically so that conscious attention is not overwhelmed. Consider how rarely you think about breathing, yet how precisely it is regulated. The rhythm adjusts to activity level, emotional state, posture, and even thought. When anxious, breathing becomes shallow and rapid. When calm, it slows and deepens. These changes often happen before you're aware of feeling anxious or calm. The body shifts first. Awareness labels the state afterward. The same is true for muscle tension. The body subtly prepares for action based on perceived demands. Shoulders lift, jaw tightens, hands clench. These adjustments reflect readiness, not intention. The subconscious is positioning the body for what it expects might happen next. Conscious thought often notices the tension only when it becomes uncomfortable. Heart rate variability is another example. The balance between activation and relaxation in the cardiovascular system shifts continuously based on perceived safety. When the environment feels predictable, variability increases, allowing flexibility. When threat is perceived, variability decreases, favoring readiness. These shifts occur automatically. You do not decide how your heart responds to uncertainty. Digestion is also influenced by subconscious processing. Under stress, digestive activity is suppressed. Energy is redirected towards systems needed for immediate action. This is not a malfunction, it is prioritization. In environments where danger was physical and immediate, digesting food could wait. The body still follows these rules, even when the danger is a looming deadline or unresolved social tension. These bodily responses are not random. They are coordinated patterns shaped by evolution and experience. The subconscious integrates sensory input, memory, and prediction to decide which bodily state is most appropriate. That decision happens continuously. You live inside the result. One reason the body plays such a central role is speed. Bodily systems can respond faster than conscious thought. Hormonal changes, autonomic shifts, and muscle activation can occur in milliseconds. This allows the organism to prepare before a threat is fully identified. Conscious awareness arrives later, informed by these changes. This ordering explains why feelings often seem embodied rather than conceptual. Anxiety feels like tightness, restlessness, or heat. Sadness feels heavy, slow, or drained. Calm feels open, steady, and grounded. These sensations are not metaphors. They are literal descriptions of bodily state. The subconscious communicates through physiology. Because of this, attempts to change emotional states purely through thought often fail. Reasoning operates at a different level. You can tell yourself that something is fine, but if the body is still in a state of readiness, the feeling persists. The subconscious has not received evidence that conditions have changed. This does not mean thoughts are irrelevant. Thoughts influence the body indirectly by shaping interpretation and expectation. But the loop is bidirectional. The body also influences thought. Posture, breathing, and movement send signals back to the brain about safety and effort. Slumped posture can bias mood downward. Slow breathing can bias it toward calm. These effects occur even when people are unaware of them. This feedback loop is one reason habits are so physically grounded. Habitual response is not just a mental decision. It is a coordinated bodily pattern. When a habit is triggered, muscles, breathing, and attention align automatically. The body knows what comes next. Conscious awareness often arrives once the pattern is already in motion. This physical embedding of habits explains why breaking them feels uncomfortable. Changing a habit requires the body to tolerate unfamiliar states. A new response may feel awkward or tense simply because the system has not practiced it. The discomfort is not a signal that something is wrong. It is a signal that the pattern is new. Stress highlights the body's role in subconscious processing particularly clearly. Under stress, the balance of the nervous system shifts toward activation. Hormones associated with alertness and energy are released. This prepares the body for action but also narrows attention and reduces flexibility. The subconscious prioritizes immediate demands over long-term planning. In this state, the body becomes more reactive. Small stimuli provoke stronger responses. Tolerance for ambiguity decreases. This is not a personality change. It is a state change. The same person can think and behave very differently depending on bodily condition. Fatigue has similar effects. When energy is low, the subconscious reduces effortful processing. Automatic behaviors dominate. Emotional regulation weakens. This is why people are more irritable and impulsive when tired. The body is signaling limited resources and the subconscious adjusts priorities accordingly. Pain also reshapes subconscious processing. Chronic pain teaches the system to remain vigilant. Attention is drawn inward. The body becomes guarded. Over time, this can alter posture, movement, and even emotional tone. The system adapts to protect the injured area, sometimes beyond what is necessary. This adaptation can persist after the original injury is healed. Another important aspect of the body's role is interoception, the brain's ability to sense internal states. Signals from the gut, heart, lungs, and muscles are constantly monitored. These signals contribute to emotional experience. A flutter in the stomach may be interpreted as excitement or anxiety depending on context. The sensation comes first. The interpretation follows. Because of this, bodily sensations can be misread. A racing heart due to caffeine may be interpreted as anxiety. Tightness due to poor posture may be interpreted as stress. The subconscious uses context and past experience to make sense of these signals. Sometimes it guesses wrong. The feeling still feels real. This misinterpretation can create feedback loops. Interpreting a bodily sensation as threat increases arousal, which intensifies the sensation. The loop continues until something interrupts it. Awareness alone may not be enough. The body needs evidence that the state is manageable. Movement is one of the primary ways the subconscious regulates itself. Walking, stretching, and rhythmic motion influence nervous system balance. These effects are not psychological in the abstract sense. They are physiological. Movement alters breathing, circulation, and muscle tone, which feed back into emotional state. This is why restlessness often accompanies anxiety. The body is prepared to act. Suppressing movement can increase discomfort. Gentle movement can provide an outlet for excess activation. The subconscious recognizes this because movement historically resolved threat. Stillness has its own role. When safety is perceived, the body can afford to settle. Slow, controlled breathing and relaxed posture signal that vigilance can decrease. These signals are registered subconsciously. Over time, repeated experiences of calm bodily states teach the system that stillness is safe. Social interaction also influences the body directly. Facial expressions, tone of voice, and proximity affect autonomic regulation. Warm, predictable interaction can lower arousal. Hostile or ambiguous interaction can raise it. These effects occur even when words are polite. The subconscious reads nonverbal cues quickly and adjusts bodily state accordingly. This sensitivity explains why certain people feel calming and others feel draining. The difference is not mystical. It lies in how the body responds to subtle cues. Over time, the subconscious learns which interactions are regulating and which are destabilizing. It adjusts anticipation and readiness before you consciously decide how you feel about someone. The body also stores memory in the form of learned patterns of response. This is sometimes referred to as somatic memory. It does not mean the body remembers events the brain does not. It means that repeated experiences shape habitual bodily responses. A person who has experienced repeated stress may hold tension even at rest. The body has learned that readiness is the default. Changing these patterns requires more than insight. It requires new bodily experiences. The subconscious updates its expectations when it repeatedly experiences safety in states that were once associated with threat. This might involve tolerating relaxation, stillness, or openness long enough for the system to register that nothing bad happens. This can feel counterintuitive. Calm may initially feel uncomfortable if the system is used to vigilance. The body may interpret relaxation as vulnerability. The discomfort is not a sign of danger. It is a sign of unfamiliarity. With repetition, the system can learn a new baseline. The connection between the subconscious and the body also explains why certain practices affect emotional well-being even when they are not framed psychologically. Breathing exercises, physical therapy, yoga, and slow movement all influence autonomic balance. They change the signals the body sends to the brain. The subconscious responds to those signals. This does not mean the body controls the mind or vice versa. It means they are inseparable. Subconscious processing emerges from their interaction. Trying to change one without acknowledging the other limits effectiveness. Another implication of this integration is that signals from the body can be mistaken for intuition or instinct. Sometimes this is accurate. The body may be responding to subtle cues that conscious awareness has not yet identified. Other times, the signal reflects an old pattern that no longer fits. Distinguishing between these cases requires context and experience, not immediate judgment. The subconscious does not label bodily signals as old or new. It simply reacts. Conscious awareness can help interpret and contextualize them, but only if it understands their origin. Assuming every bodily signal is meaningful or meaningless leads to confusion. The signals are meaningful in that they reflect the system's current state, but they are not always about the present situation. This understanding reframes how physical symptoms are experienced. Tension, fatigue, and discomfort are not just problems to eliminate. They are messages about system load, expectation, and readiness. Addressing them requires adjusting conditions, not just thoughts. As attention moves forward, the next step is to look at how these bodily processes continue their work when conscious awareness recedes, particularly during sleep. The subconscious does not rest when you do. It reorganizes, consolidates, and recalibrates through the night, using the body as both input and output. To understand how deeply the subconscious runs your life, it becomes necessary to follow it into the hours when you're no longer watching, and see what it does with the material of the day, while the body lies still and the mind drifts elsewhere. When the body lies still and the outside world fades, the subconscious does not power down, it shifts roles. During sleep, especially in its deeper and more active phases, the mind enters a mode where many of the constraints of waking consciousness loosen. Attention narrows, sensory input is reduced, and deliberate control recedes. What remains is a landscape where memory, emotion, and prediction continue to operate, but without the usual requirement to stay tethered to immediate reality. Dreams are the most visible expression of this night shift, but they are only the surface of a much broader set of processes unfolding beneath awareness. To understand dreams, it helps to start by discarding the idea that they exist primarily to tell stories or deliver messages. Dreams are not written for an audience. They are not composed with clarity or coherence in mind. They emerge from a system that is busy doing other work, and their strange, fragmented quality reflects that purpose. They are byproducts of processing, not the goal itself. Sleep is not a uniform state. The brain cycles through different stages, each characterized by distinct patterns of activity. Some stages are dominated by slow, synchronized neural rhythms. Others, particularly REM sleep, involve heightened activity in many brain regions alongside near-complete muscle paralysis. It is during these more active phases that vivid dreaming most often occurs, though simpler dreamlike experiences can arise in other stages as well. During REM sleep, areas involved in emotion, memory and imagery are highly active, while regions associated with executive control and logical sequencing are less so. This imbalance explains much of what dreams feel like: emotional intensity without clear cause, events that flow without logic, a lack of critical questioning. The mind is generating content without its usual editor. The subconscious uses this state to integrate information gathered during waking hours. Experiences are replayed, recombined, and reweighted. Memories are strengthened or weakened. Emotional associations are adjusted. The goal is not accuracy, but relevance. The system is asking which patterns matter and how they should influence future prediction. Dreams often draw on recent experiences, but rarely in literal form. A conversation may appear as a symbolic interaction. A worry may surface as a physical obstacle. A feeling may be represented by an environment rather than an event. This abstraction is not intentional. It reflects the way memory is organized. Memories are stored as networks of association, not as linear narratives. When those networks are activated together, the resulting imagery can feel strange. Emotion plays a central role in this process. Emotional experiences are more likely to be reactivated during sleep because they carry higher predictive value. A stressful interaction, an unresolved conflict, or a significant change in routine is more likely to appear in dream content than a neutral event. The subconscious treats these experiences as needing further processing. This processing does not require conscious insight. The system is not trying to explain anything to you. It is adjusting internal models. When a dream revisits a fear, it may be weakening the association by replaying it in a safe context. When it revisits a reward, it may be strengthening motivation. The imagery is not the message. The adjustment is. This perspective helps explain why dreams can be repetitive. A recurring theme often reflects an unresolved prediction. This system has not yet settled on a reliable expectation. It keeps revisiting the material because it has not been integrated into a stable model. Once integration occurs, the dream content often fades. Dreams also play a role in creativity and problem solving, though not in a deliberate way. By loosening constraints, the subconscious can explore combinations that waking logic would reject. This can lead to novel connections. However, most of these connections are never remembered. The few that surface into awareness feel remarkable, because they cross the boundary between systems. The boundary itself is important. Most dream content is not remembered because memory consolidation during sleep does not prioritize recall. It prioritizes function. Remembering a dream is not necessary for the adjustment it produced to take effect. Forgetting is not a failure. It is the default. When dreams are remembered, it is often because something interrupted the process. Awakening during or shortly after a dream allows fragments to enter conscious memory. These fragments are often incomplete and distorted because they were not meant to be stored as narratives. Conscious memory tries to impose structure on material that was never organized that way. This mismatch is one reason dream interpretation is so unreliable when treated literally. The same dream imagery can arise from very different underlying processes. A falling dream does not mean the same thing for everyone. The image reflects a pattern of activation, not a fixed symbol. Meaning is personal and contextual, not universal. That said, dreams can still provide information, but not in the way people often expect. They can highlight emotional themes, unresolved concerns, or shifts in expectation. They can reveal what the subconscious has been spending time on. The key is to look at the emotional tone rather than the plot. How did it feel? What states were present? Fear, relief, confusion, curiosity. These states are closer to the underlying process than the images themselves. Another function of dreaming appears to involve emotional regulation. During REM sleep, stress-related neurochemicals are reduced while emotional memory circuits remain active. This creates a context where emotionally charged memories can be reactivated without the same physiological intensity. Over time, this can soften emotional responses. The memory remains, but its charge is reduced. This mechanism helps explain why sleep deprivation worsens emotional reactivity. Without sufficient REM sleep, emotional memories remain raw. They have not been given the chance to be processed in a lower stress context. The subconscious has not completed its overnight work. Dreams also interact with the body. Although muscles are largely inhibited during REM sleep, autonomic responses still occur. Heart rate can change. Breathing can shift. These bodily responses feed back into the dream content, creating loops between physiology and imagery. Again, this happens without awareness or control. Nightmares are an extreme example of this interaction. They often arise when fear-related systems remain highly active during sleep. This can happen after trauma, during periods of intense stress, or when sleep is fragmented. The dream becomes a rehearsal of threat without sufficient safety cues to dampen the response. The experience feels overwhelming because the usual regulatory balance is disrupted. Even then, nightmares are not evidence of failure. They are evidence of a system trying to process material under difficult conditions. The repetition reflects persistence, not pathology. When conditions improve and safety increases, nightmares often diminish without direct intervention. Another interesting aspect of dreams is their relationship to identity. During dreams, the sense of self is often fluid. You may be a participant, an observer, or someone else entirely. This fluidity reflects the fact that the sense of self is a construct maintained by waking consciousness. When that maintenance relaxes, identity becomes more flexible. The subconscious does not require a consistent narrative self to operate. This flexibility can be unsettling when noticed, but it reveals something important. The feeling of being a continuous, stable self is not a given. It is an achievement of the waking mind. The subconscious operates without that constraint, focusing instead on patterns and states. Dreams can also blur time. Events from different periods of life can coexist. This reflects the non-linear organization of memory. Past experiences are not stored in chronological order. They are stored by association. When associations are activated together, time collapses. The dream does not distinguish between then and now because the subconscious is not bound by narrative sequence. This collapse of time can give dreams a sense of significance or depth. Old emotions resurface. Familiar places reappear. The experience can feel meaningful even when it's confusing. The meaning lies in the reactivation, not in the storyline. Lucid dreaming, where awareness arises within a dream, offers a glimpse into the interaction between systems. In these moments, elements of conscious control return while the dream environment persists. This state is rare and unstable because it requires a balance between activation and inhibition that the brain does not naturally maintain. It illustrates how distinct the usual roles of the systems are. Most of the time, the subconscious prefers to work without interference. Conscious oversight would slow the process. It would introduce judgment and narrative where flexibility is needed. The night shift is efficient precisely because it is unobserved. Dreams also reflect learning. New skills and experiences can appear in dream content as the brain integrates them. Athletes, musicians, and language learners often report dreaming about practice. These dreams are not rehearsals in the conscious sense. They are reflections of neural activity strengthening relevant pathways. The same applies to emotional learning. New roles, relationships, or responsibilities may appear in symbolic form as the subconscious updates its models. The dream does not announce the update. It simply reflects that the system is working with new data. Importantly, the absence of dreams does not mean the absence of processing. Many people do not remember dreams regularly. Their subconscious is still active. Dream recall varies widely based on sleep patterns, timing of awakening, and individual differences. The work continues regardless of recall. Modern life can interfere with this night shift. Irregular sleep schedules, chronic stress, alcohol, and constant stimulation can fragment sleep architecture. When sleep is fragmented, the subconscious has fewer uninterrupted cycles to complete its tasks. This can leave emotional processing unfinished and memory integration incomplete. This does not mean sleep must be perfect to be effective. The system is resilient, but consistent disruption accumulates. Over time, the mind carries more unprocessed material into waking hours. Thoughts feel noisier, emotions feel less regulated. The boundary between night work and day work blurs. Understanding dreams as part of the subconscious's night shift reframes their role. They are not messages to decode or puzzles to solve, they are signs of activity. They show that the system is continuing its work when conscious attention steps aside. As attention moves forward, the focus will shift from what happens when consciousness recedes to how subconscious processes shape waking thought in subtler ways, particularly through shortcuts and biases that influence judgment without announcing themselves. The night shift prepares the ground, the day shift inherits the results, often without knowing where they came from, carrying those adjustments forward into the next stretch of conscious life. The subconscious is not designed to evaluate the world from scratch each time something happens. Doing so would be impossibly slow and inefficient. Instead, it relies on shortcuts. These shortcuts take the form of biases, assumptions, and heuristics that simplify decision-making by reducing complexity. They are not signs of flawed thinking. They are the mechanisms that make thinking possible at all under real-world conditions. A bias, in this context, is not a moral failing or an error in judgment. It is a systematic tendency to interpret information in a particular way based on past experience. The subconscious develops these tendencies because they speed up prediction. When the brain encounters a familiar pattern, it does not pause to analyze every detail. It fills in gaps, prioritizes certain cues, and suppresses others. The result is a fast, workable interpretation that allows action to proceed. Assumptions operate in a similar way. They are unspoken expectations about how the world works, how people behave, and how situations tend to unfold. Most assumptions never enter awareness. They function as background settings. You assume the floor will support your weight. You assume language will follow familiar rules. You assume social interactions will follow certain norms. These assumptions free the mind from constantly rechecking basic facts. Mental shortcuts emerge because the environment is too complex to process fully. Every moment contains far more information than the brain can handle consciously. The subconscious solves this problem by filtering. It decides what matters and what can be ignored. This filtering is shaped by what has been useful or harmful in the past. Over time, the filters become stable. One of the most common shortcuts is categorization. The brain groups stimuli into categories based on similarity. This allows rapid recognition. You do not evaluate each object as unique. You recognize it as an instance of something you have encountered before. This applies not only to objects but to people, situations, and emotions. Categorization speeds response, but it also reduces nuance. Once a category is activated, associated expectations follow. If a situation resembles a known type, the subconscious predicts likely outcomes based on previous encounters with similar situations. This prediction shapes emotional response and behavior. Conscious thought may later adjust the interpretation, but the initial bias has already influenced perception. Another shortcut involves availability. Events that are easily recalled feel more common or likely than they actually are. This happens because the subconscious uses memory accessibility as a proxy for probability. If something comes to mind quickly, the system treats it as relevant. Emotional intensity, recency, and repetition all increase accessibility. This is why rare but vivid events can dominate judgment. Confirmation bias is another well-known example. Once the subconscious forms a prediction, it favors information that supports it and downplays information that contradicts it. This is not deliberate dishonesty. It is a way of maintaining model stability. Constantly revising predictions is costly. The system prefers to preserve its existing framework unless forced to change. This tendency is especially strong when predictions are tied to emotional safety or identity. If a belief helps the system feel oriented or protected, it becomes harder to dislodge. Contradictory information may be dismissed or reinterpreted. The subconscious is not trying to defend an opinion. It's trying to avoid destabilization. Bias also influences how intentions are inferred. The brain is quick to assign motives to others based on limited information. Tone, expression, and past experience shape these inferences. Once an intention is assumed, behavior is interpreted through that lens. This can lead to misunderstandings that feel obvious in hindsight, but compelling in the moment. Another shortcut involves attribution. People tend to explain their own behavior differently from others. When judging oneself, context is emphasized. When judging others, traits are emphasized. This difference arises because the subconscious has access to internal states for oneself, but must rely on external cues for others. The shortcut works most of the time but can distort social judgment. Biases also shape how effort is allocated. The brain prefers options that require less cognitive load. Familiar paths feel easier than unfamiliar ones, even when the unfamiliar option might be better. This preference is not laziness, it is energy conservation. The subconscious favors what has worked before because it is predictable. Importantly, biases are adaptive in stable environments. When conditions are consistent, shortcuts save time and reduce error. Problems arise when environments change or when biases are applied outside their original domain. A shortcut learned in one context may misfire in another. The subconscious does not automatically detect this mismatch. Cultural learning plays a significant role in shaping assumptions. Norms, values, and expectations are absorbed through observation long before they are articulated. These learned assumptions influence what feels normal, acceptable, or risky. They operate beneath awareness, guiding behavior without explicit instruction. Language itself carries assumptions. Words frame perception. The way concepts are labelled influences how they are grouped and evaluated. The subconscious absorbs these frames through repeated exposure. This shapes thought patterns in ways that feel natural but are culturally specific. Bias also affects memory. Experiences that fit existing assumptions are more easily integrated. Those that contradict them may be forgotten or altered. This is not intentional distortion. It is a consequence of how memory consolidation works. The system prioritizes coherence over completeness. Mental shortcuts can create blind spots. Because the subconscious filters information, some possibilities never reach awareness. An option may not feel available simply because it has no positive history. This can limit creativity and flexibility. Conscious effort can expand awareness, but it cannot force the subconscious to value what it has not learned to trust. It is also important to note that biases are not uniform. Different people develop different shortcuts based on their experiences. Two people can encounter the same situation and respond very differently because their predictive models differ. Neither response is arbitrary. Each reflects a learned pattern. Attempts to eliminate bias entirely are misguided. Without shortcuts, the mind would be overwhelmed. The goal is not to remove biases, but to understand when they are likely to mislead. Awareness can create space for correction, but only if it recognizes the shortcut at work. Bias becomes most visible under uncertainty. When information is incomplete, the subconscious relies more heavily on assumptions. This can produce overconfidence or excessive caution depending on the system's history. In familiar situations, bias feels like intuition. In unfamiliar ones, it can feel like confusion. Stress amplifies reliance on shortcuts. Under pressure, the brain favors speed over accuracy. Automatic judgments dominate. This is why people are more prone to stereotyping, impulsive decisions, and rigid thinking when stressed. The subconscious is prioritizing efficiency. Fatigue has a similar effect. When energy is low, conscious oversight weakens. The mind falls back on default patterns. This does not reflect true preference. It reflects reduced capacity for deliberation. Understanding bias as a function of the subconscious changes how it is addressed. Arguing against a bias rarely works because the bias is not a belief, it is a prediction. Predictions update through experience, not debate. Exposure to new patterns in relevant context gradually reshapes assumptions. This does not mean reflection is useless. Conscious awareness can notice bias and choose to pause or seek additional information. That pause creates the opportunity for new experience. Over time, repeated pauses can influence the underlying model. The change is indirect but real. Bias also interacts with emotion. Emotional states influence which shortcuts are activated. Fear biases toward threat. Comfort biases toward openness. Mood shifts the weighting of predictions. This is why the same information can be interpreted differently on different days. The subconscious does not announce when it is using a shortcut. The resulting judgment feels immediate and self-evident. This is what makes biases difficult to detect from the inside. They do not feel like distortions. They feel like reality. Recognizing this is not about distrusting every intuition. It is about understanding its origin. Intuition is fast prediction based on prior learning. Sometimes it is accurate. Sometimes it is outdated. Its reliability depends on how well the past matches the present. As attention moves forward, the focus will turn to a question that naturally follows from all of this. If so much of thought and behavior is guided by automatic predictions, habits, emotions, and shortcuts, where does conscious choice fit in at all? Exploring that tension leads directly into the experience many people have of deciding after the fact, and the uneasy feeling that free will may not work the way it intuitively seems to, even though it continues to feel central to how life unfolds. Free will feels obvious from the inside. You experience yourself as making choices, weighing options, deciding what to do next. This experience is so familiar that questioning it can feel pointless or even unsettling. Yet when the mechanisms described so far are taken seriously, a tension emerges. If the subconscious is predicting, prioritizing, and preparing actions before awareness arrives, then what exactly is the role of conscious choice? The sense of free will does not disappear under examination, but it does begin to look different from how it is usually imagined. To approach this carefully, it helps to separate experience from explanation. The experience of choosing is real. You feel yourself deciding. That feeling matters because it shapes responsibility, identity, and social life. The question is not whether the feeling exists, but what produces it, and how much control it actually represents over the processes that lead to action. From a biological perspective, actions begin as neural activity. That activity does not start at the moment you become aware of an intention. It starts earlier, as competing possibilities are evaluated by subconscious systems. These systems integrate memory, emotion, bodily state, and context to estimate which actions are most likely to lead to acceptable outcomes. This evaluation unfolds gradually, below awareness. By the time a particular option rises into consciousness as what I want to do, much of the work has already been done. This does not mean the decision was predetermined in a rigid sense. It means the decision emerged from processes that are not directly accessible to introspection. Conscious awareness receives the result of those processes as an intention. The experience feels like authorship because the intention aligns with the self, but the authorship is distributed, not centralized. Experiments that measure brain activity support this view. Neural signals associated with movement preparation and decision bias can often be detected before people report having consciously decided. These findings are sometimes presented as proof that free will is an illusion. That framing is too simplistic. What the experiments show is that conscious awareness is not the starting point of action. It is part of a longer chain. The brain prepares multiple possible actions in parallel. It evaluates them based on predicted outcomes. When one option reaches a certain threshold of activation, it becomes dominant. Conscious awareness experiences this dominance as a decision. The feeling of choosing corresponds to the moment when one option wins the competition. From the inside, this feels like free will. From the outside, it looks like a system resolving uncertainty. Both descriptions are valid at their respective levels. The mistake comes from assuming that free will must mean conscious control over every contributing factor. Biology does not support that assumption. Another source of confusion is the way free will is often framed as independence from influence. In reality, no decision is made in a vacuum. Every choice is shaped by prior experience, current state, and available options. The subconscious constrains what feels possible or desirable before conscious reasoning begins. Conscious thought then works within those constraints. This does not make choice meaningless. It makes it contextual. You choose among the options that feel available. Those options are shaped by learning. Over time, choices feed back into learning, altering what will feel available next time. There is influence in both directions. One way to understand this is to think of conscious choice as a steering mechanism rather than an engine. It cannot generate motion from nothing, but it can influence direction. It can pause, reflect, and sometimes override automatic tendencies, especially when conditions allow. That influence is real, but it is limited and effortful. Effort is an important clue here. When choices feel effortless, the subconscious and conscious systems are aligned. Prediction strongly favors one option. Conscious thought agrees. When choices feel difficult, there is conflict. Competing predictions are active. Conscious effort is required to maintain a particular direction. This effort is not constant because it consumes resources. This explains why self-control fluctuates. It is not a fixed trait. It depends on energy, stress, and context. Under ideal conditions, conscious oversight can exert meaningful influence. Under strain, the system defaults to automatic patterns. This does not mean values have changed. It means the balance between systems has shifted. Another reason free will feels illusory at times is that consciousness often arrives late. You may notice yourself reaching for something before you realize you intended to. You may speak before fully deciding what to say. These moments highlight the lag between preparation and awareness. The action was already in motion when awareness caught up, yet there are also moments when awareness intervenes early. You notice an impulse and choose not to act on it. These moments tend to require quiet, time, and sufficient energy. They are less dramatic than impulsive actions, but they demonstrate that conscious influence exists. It is simply not omnipresent. The sense of free will is also reinforced by narrative. Humans are storytelling organisms. We organize experience into causes and reasons. After an action occurs, the conscious mind constructs an explanation that fits the self-image and available information. This explanation may be partially accurate or largely post hoc. Either way, it creates coherence. This coherence is socially important. Responsibility, trust, and cooperation depend on treating people as agents. Even if decisions emerge from complex processes, treating them as intentional supports social functioning. The experience of free will serves a purpose beyond accuracy. It supports accountability and learning. There is also a deeper layer to this. The feeling of choosing is part of how the brain monitors its own activity. conscious awareness tracks decisions to adjust future behaviour. Without this tracking, learning would be less flexible. The sense of agency helps integrate outcomes with identity. When people worry that free will is an illusion, they often fear that this undermines responsibility or meaning. That fear assumes that responsibility requires complete independence from influence. Biology suggests otherwise. Responsibility arises from the capacity to learn, reflect, and adjust behaviour over time. Those capacities remain intact even when choices are constrained. In fact, understanding the limits of free will can increase responsibility rather than reduce it. When behaviour is seen as the product of learning and context, change becomes a matter of altering conditions rather than assigning blame. This perspective supports compassion without denying accountability. It is also worth noting that the feeling of free will varies. In states of flow, action feels spontaneous and unforced. The sense of choosing recedes, yet behaviour is often skilled and effective. In contrast, in moments of conflict or indecision, the feeling of free will intensifies. You feel yourself choosing because the system is negotiating. This suggests that the experience of free will is not constant because it reflects system dynamics. It becomes more prominent when alignment is low and less prominent when alignment is high. The illusion, if it is one, is not that free will exists, but that it is always present in the same way. Cultural beliefs also shape how free will is experienced. Societies that emphasize individual autonomy encourage people to attend to internal choice. Societies that emphasize collective roles encourage attention to context. The underlying processes are similar, but the interpretation differs. Another important point is that the subconscious is not separate from you. When it biases a decision, it is not an external force acting on an inner self. It is part of the same organism. The distinction between conscious and subconscious is functional, not personal. Both are expressions of the same system operating at different speeds. This reframing softens the idea of illusion. It is not that free will is fake, it is that it is partial. It reflects the experience of a system that can influence itself but not fully observe or control all of its components. The feeling of authorship is real, but it is not absolute. As this exploration continues, the next step is to look at how these dynamics shape identity. If choices emerge from patterns learned over time, then the sense of self is also shaped by those patterns. Identity begins to look less like a fixed essence, and more like an evolving summary of tendencies, expectations, and narratives. Understanding that shift helps explain why people feel both stable and changeable at the same time, carrying a sense of who I am that feels solid even as the underlying processes continue to adapt beneath awareness. Identity feels personal, deliberate, and internally consistent. You experience yourself as someone with traits, preferences, values, and a recognizable way of responding to the world. This sense of who I am feels stable enough that it carries across days and years, even as circumstances change. Yet when identity is examined through the lens of subconscious processes, it begins to look less like a fixed core and more like an accumulation of patterns, not chosen all at once, not designed from the top down, but gradually shaped by learning, repetition, and prediction operating beneath awareness. From early in life, the subconscious begins tracking regularities in behavior and outcome. Certain responses lead to relief, others lead to discomfort, some bring connection, others bring rejection. Over time, these patterns stabilize. The brain begins to expect itself to respond in certain ways in certain situations. These expectations are not abstract beliefs. They are predictions about one's own behavior. Identity begins here, long before it is put into words. When you say something like, "I'm the kind of person who avoids conflict," or "I've always been independent," you're describing the output of repeated patterns, not their cause. The subconscious noticed consistency and built expectations around it. Those expectations then influence future behavior, making the pattern more likely to repeat, Identity, in this sense, is both a summary and a reinforcement of what has already been learned. This process is efficient. If the brain had to treat every situation as a blank slate, decision-making would be exhausting. Predicting how you will respond simplifies planning. It reduces uncertainty. The subconscious uses identity as a shortcut, not as a truth claim. It treats who you are as a reliable indicator of what you're likely to do. Because of this, identity is deeply tied to habit. Habits are not just actions repeated over time. They are evidence the system uses to infer stability. If a behavior occurs frequently across contexts, it is tagged as characteristic. The more emotionally charged the behavior, the stronger this tagging becomes. Over time, the behavior feels less like something you do and more like something you are. This shift has important consequences. Once a pattern becomes part of identity, changing it feels riskier. The subconscious is not just updating a response, it is updating a prediction about the self. That prediction has been used to navigate the world. Altering it introduces uncertainty. Even positive change can feel destabilizing because it violates expectations about how you normally operate. Identity also emerges through contrast. The subconscious learns not only what responses are likely, but which ones are unlikely. These excluded options fade from awareness. You may not think, I could act differently here, but won't. The alternative simply does not present itself. The range of perceived choice narrows around the identity pattern. This narrowing is subtle. It does not feel like limitation. It feels like authenticity. Acting in line with established patterns feels natural. Acting against them feels awkward or forced. The subconscious interprets familiarity as correctness. This can be helpful when patterns are adaptive. It can be limiting when they're outdated. Social feedback plays a major role in shaping identity. From early interactions, the subconscious tracks how others respond to different aspects of behavior. Approval, attention, criticism, and neglect all provide data. Behaviors that lead to positive social outcomes are reinforced. Those that lead to negative outcomes are suppressed. Over time, this social learning becomes internalized. Eventually, external feedback is no longer required. The subconscious predicts how others would respond and adjusts behavior in advance. This prediction becomes part of identity. You may describe yourself as confident, cautious, quiet, or outspoken, but those labels reflect learned expectations about social consequence as much as internal preference. Language then enters the process. Once patterns are labelled, they become easier to reference and repeat. Labels compress complexity. Saying I'm introverted or I'm bad at math turns a set of experiences into a stable trait. This subconscious does not understand the nuance of these statements. It understands consistency. When a label is repeated internally or externally, it reinforces the associated pattern. This does not mean labels are false. They often capture something real. The issue is that they can freeze patterns that were originally flexible. A tendency becomes a rule. A habit becomes a trait. The subconscious treats the label as confirmation of prediction. Acting outside it feels like violating a rule rather than trying something new. Identity is also shaped by emotional memory. Experiences associated with strong emotion leave deeper marks. If a particular way of being led to safety during a stressful period, the system may preserve it long after the context has changed. A child who learned to stay quiet to avoid conflict may carry that pattern into adulthood, even when the original threat is gone. The identity formed was adaptive once. The subconscious does not automatically retire it. Another layer comes from bodily patterns. As discussed earlier, the body participates in subconscious processing. Over time, characteristic postures, movement styles, and baseline levels of tension become part of how a person experiences themselves. Someone may feel on edge or low energy, not because of a conscious belief, but because the body has learned a default state. That bodily state feeds into identity without requiring interpretation. Identity also feels stable because memory selectively reinforces it. Experiences that fit the existing self-concept are more easily integrated. Experiences that contradict it may be discounted or forgotten. This is not deception, it is coherence maintenance. The subconscious prefers a consistent model of the self because it simplifies prediction. This preference explains why people often reinterpret events to fit identity. A failure may be explained as evidence of a long-standing weakness. A success may be dismissed as luck. The explanation protects the existing model. Updating identity requires repeated contradictions strong enough to outweigh that protection. It is important to recognize that identity is not housed in a single place. It is distributed across many systems. Emotional responses, habitual actions, expectations, and narratives all contribute. There is no central self module deciding who you are. The sense of self emerges from coordination among these processes. This distributed nature explains why identity can feel fragmented. You may behave one way in one context and differently in another. Each context activates different learned patterns. The subconscious does not require consistency across all situations. Conscious narrative tries to impose it afterward. Over time, the narrative self smooths these variations into a coherent story. You explain differences in behavior as exceptions, moods, or roles. This storytelling serves a purpose. It creates continuity, but it can also obscure how flexible identity actually is beneath the story. Change becomes difficult not because identity is fixed, but because the subconscious has invested in its predictions. Changing behavior means providing new data. That data must be consistent, emotionally tolerable, and repeated in the relevant contexts. Occasional exceptions are treated as noise. This is why identity change often feels slow and indirect. You may begin acting differently before you feel like a different person. The system updates behavior first, then gradually updates expectation, and only later does the narrative self catch up. At some point, the new pattern feels natural. Identity has shifted, not through declaration, but through experience. Another important implication is that identity is always provisional, even when it feels permanent. The subconscious continues learning as long as you are alive. New environments, relationships, and challenges introduce new patterns. Some identities loosen, others strengthen. Stability is real, but it is maintained, not given. Understanding identity as a product of subconscious learning reframes self-criticism. Patterns are not moral flaws, they are learned responses. They persist because they were once useful or protective. This does not mean they must remain forever. It means they require different conditions to change than conscious intention alone. It also reframes growth. Growth is not the creation of a new self from nothing. It is the gradual reweighting of existing patterns and the introduction of new ones. The subconscious does not erase the past, it builds on it. Old tendencies may remain available, especially under stress, but they no longer dominate. The feeling of being yourself arises when current behavior aligns with current predictions. When that alignment shifts, the feeling can be unsettling. You may feel inauthentic or unsure even when the change is healthy. The discomfort reflects uncertainty, not error. The system is updating. This perspective also explains why people often feel more like themselves over time, even as they change. What feels authentic is not a fixed essence, but familiarity. As new patterns stabilize, they become the new baseline. The subconscious updates its model. The narrative follows. As attention moves forward, the next question becomes unavoidable. If identity is shaped by subconscious learning rather than fixed choice, can it be intentionally influenced at all? Understanding where leverage exists and where it does not requires looking closely at how subconscious patterns are modified, challenged, and sometimes reshaped over time, not through force, but through carefully altered experience that the system can register and trust. The idea that the subconscious might be changeable sits at the centre of many hopes and frustrations. On one hand, people sense that their patterns are learned rather than chosen, shaped by experience rather than intention. On the other, those same patterns often feel stubborn, automatic, and resistant to effort. This creates a natural question. If the subconscious learned its way into these habits, emotions, and expectations, can it learn its way out of them? The short answer is yes, but not in the way most people expect, and not on the timeline conscious thought usually prefers. The first thing to clarify is what change actually means in this context. Changing the subconscious does not mean erasing parts of the mind or rewriting history. The brain does not work by deleting old learning and replacing it wholesale with new instructions. It works by layering. New patterns are added. Old ones lose influence when they are no longer reliable. Some remain dormant but available. Change is about shifting probabilities, not flipping switches. This distinction matters because many people approach change as if the subconscious were a stubborn opponent that needs to be convinced or overpowered. They try to reason with it, argue against it, or suppress its outputs. These strategies usually fail because the subconscious does not respond to reasoning in the abstract. It responds to experience. It updates when predictions are violated consistently enough to require revision. To understand how change happens, it helps to revisit how learning occurred in the first place. The subconscious learned through repetition, emotional consequence, and context. It paid attention to what happened, how it felt, and what followed. It didn't ask whether the lesson was fair. It did not check whether it aligned with long-term goals. It simply registered patterns. Any attempt to change those patterns has to work through the same channels. One of the most important factors in subconscious change is exposure. This does not mean overwhelming exposure or forcing oneself into situations that feel intolerable. It means allowing the system to encounter new outcomes in the same contexts where old predictions were formed. The subconscious updates when it repeatedly experiences something different from what it expected, and when that difference does not lead to harm. This is why change is often slow. The system is conservative by design. It learns certain patterns because they once helped reduce uncertainty or discomfort. Abandoning them too quickly would increase risk. The subconscious waits for enough evidence to justify revision. A single positive experience is treated as an exception. A consistent pattern is treated as information. Another critical factor is emotional tolerance. The subconscious will not update if the new experience is overwhelmingly distressing. In such cases, the system focuses on survival rather than learning. This is why attempts at change that rely on force or pressure often backfire. They reinforce threat rather than safety, strengthening the very patterns they are meant to undo. Change happens most effectively when new experiences are tolerable, not when they are dramatic. Small manageable differences repeated over time provide the system with usable data. They show that the old prediction is no longer necessary. This is not a failure of ambition. It is how the learning mechanism works. Context also plays a decisive role. As discussed earlier, subconscious learning is context-specific. A pattern learned in one environment may not update in another. This is why people often feel capable in one area of life and stuck in another. The system has different expectations tied to different cues. Change has to occur in the context where the old patterns are active. This is also why insight alone rarely changes behavior. Insight happens in reflective contexts, often removed from the situations that trigger automatic responses. The subconscious may agree in theory, but it has not seen the evidence where it matters. Until new outcomes occur in the relevant situations, the old pattern remains dominant. Another important element in subconscious change is repetition. Repetition is not about mindless practice. It is about reliability. The system needs to see that the new pattern holds across time. Inconsistency slows learning. If a new response sometimes leads to relief and sometimes to distress, the system hesitates. It favours the older pattern because it is more predictable. This is where many people become discouraged. They expect change to feel rewarding early on. In reality, new patterns often feel uncomfortable at first. The old pattern feels familiar, even if it is unpleasant. The new one feels uncertain. The discomfort is not a sign that the change is wrong. It is a sign that the system has not yet updated its expectations. This discomfort can be misinterpreted as intuition or warning. In truth, it often reflects unfamiliarity. The subconscious is alert because it does not yet trust the new pattern. Trust builds through repetition, not reassurance. Over time, as the new response leads to acceptable outcomes, the discomfort decreases. The pattern becomes easier. Eventually, it may feel natural. Another pathway of change involves altering the environment rather than the individual. Because the subconscious is so responsive to cues, small changes in surroundings can have outsized effects. Adjusting routines, reducing unnecessary stressors, increasing predictability, or modifying social contexts can shift behaviour without requiring constant effort. The system responds to conditions more readily than to intentions. This is why willpower is such a poor long-term strategy. Willpower relies on conscious effort, which is limited and fluctuates. Environmental change alters what the subconscious encounters repeatedly. It changes the data stream. Over time, the system adapts without needing to be pushed. Sleep, nutrition, and physical state also influence the capacity for change. When the body is depleted, the subconscious favours automation and habit. When resources are available, flexibility increases. This is not a matter of discipline, it is a matter of system balance. Change is easier when the organism is not under constant strain. Emotional safety is particularly important. When the system feels threatened, it reverts to familiar patterns. When it feels safe, it is more willing to experiment. This does not mean eliminating all discomfort. It means ensuring that discomfort is not interpreted as danger. The difference is subtle but crucial. Social context can either support or hinder subconscious change. Repeated interactions that reinforce old roles make new patterns harder to sustain. Interactions that allow different responses create space for learning. The subconscious tracks social outcomes carefully. Acceptance, rejection, and ambiguity all matter. Change is easier when social feedback does not punish deviation from old patterns. Another aspect often overlooked is patience. The subconscious does not operate on narrative time. It does not care how long you have wanted to change. It cares how long the new pattern has been active. This mismatch can be frustrating. Conscious desire may be intense. Subconscious learning may still be minimal. The system is not resisting. It is waiting. It is also important to understand that change does not always mean elimination. Old patterns may remain available, especially under stress. This does not mean change failed. It means the system retains backups. Under conditions that resemble the original learning context, the old response may reappear. This is normal. Over time, as the new pattern proves reliable across a wider range of conditions, reliance on the old one decreases. This perspective helps reframe setbacks. A return to an old pattern is not proof that nothing changed. It is information about context, load, or safety. The system defaulted to what it trusted most under those conditions. That information can guide further adjustment rather than self-judgment. Another important distinction is between control and influence. You cannot directly control subconscious processes in the moment they activate. You can influence what they learn over time. Influence works upstream. It shapes the conditions under which learning occurs. Trying to control downstream outputs usually leads to frustration. This is why many effective approaches to change focus on exposure, consistency, and environment rather than on motivation. Motivation fluctuates. Learning accumulates. The subconscious responds to what happens, not to how strongly you wish it were different. It is also worth noting that some patterns change more easily than others. Habits tied to mild discomfort may update quickly. Patterns tied to intense fear or early learning may take longer. This does not reflect effort or worth. It reflects how strongly the original learning was reinforced and how central it became to prediction. Importantly, the subconscious never stops learning. Even when change feels stalled, learning continues. Each experience slightly adjusts probabilities. The shifts may be too small to notice day to day, but over time they accumulate. Change often becomes visible only in retrospect. Understanding that the subconscious can be changed, but only through certain pathways, reduces unnecessary conflict with oneself. The system is not broken. It is functioning as designed. Change requires working with its rules rather than against them. As this exploration continues, the next step is to look at specific ways conscious attention can interact with subconscious learning, not by issuing commands, but by shaping what the system notices and how often it notices it. Attention, when used skillfully, becomes one of the few levers that conscious awareness has. Understanding how that lever works helps explain why practices like mindfulness can influence automatic patterns over time, not by suppressing them, but by altering the conditions under which they're learned and reinforced. Attention is one of the few places where conscious awareness and subconscious processing reliably interact. It is not a command center, and it is not a force that overrides automatic systems at will. But it is a gate. What attention rests on becomes data. What it repeatedly highlights becomes relevant. Over time, this relevance shapes learning. In that sense, attention does not control the subconscious, but it influences what the subconscious learns from. Most of the time, attention is guided automatically. The subconscious decides what stands out based on prediction, emotion, and past experience. Threat draws attention. Novelty draws attention. Anything unresolved or emotionally charged tends to intrude. This automatic guidance is efficient, but it also means that attention often reinforces existing patterns without deliberate intent. Mindfulness, in its simplest form, is not about relaxation or insight. It is about noticing where attention goes and how it moves. It involves observing sensations, thoughts, and emotions as they arise, without immediately reacting to them. This sounds subtle, and it is. But that subtlety is exactly why it matters. When attention is allowed to rest on experience without immediate action, the usual loop between cue and response is altered. To see why this matters, consider how automatic learning normally works. A cue appears, a response follows, the response produces an outcome. The subconscious links the cue and the outcome, strengthening the pattern. Attention often collapses this sequence into a single flow. You notice the urge and act on it almost simultaneously. There is no space for learning anything new. When attention is sustained without immediate reaction, that sequence changes. The cue still appears, the urge still arises, but the response is delayed or modified. This creates a new outcome. Even if the outcome is simply tolerating the urge without acting, it is still information. The subconscious registers that the old response was not required for the situation to pass. This is one of the primary ways attention gains influence. It does not argue with the urge. It does not suppress it forcefully. It allows the system to experience a different trajectory. Over time, repeated exposure to this altered sequence weakens the original association and allows new predictions to form. This process is slow because the subconscious does not treat a single instance as meaningful. It looks for consistency. Each time attention interrupts an automatic loop without leading to harm, it provides a small piece of counter-evidence. Individually, these moments feel insignificant. Collectively, they matter. Mindfulness is often misunderstood as passive observation. In reality, it is an active change in how information is presented to the learning system. By staying with sensations and thoughts rather than immediately acting on them, attention changes the data stream. The subconscious learns not from words, but from what happens next. Another important aspect of attention is duration. Brief flashes of awareness have limited impact. Sustained attention allows the system to register patterns more clearly. This is why habits often feel unbreakable when attention is fragmented. The system never sees a complete alternative, it sees only interruptions. Sustained attention does not mean intense concentration, it means continuity. Gently returning attention to the same experience again and again allows learning to occur. This is true whether the experience is a physical sensation, an emotional state, or a recurring thought. Mindfulness also changes the relationship to discomfort. Normally, discomfort triggers action. The system learns that discomfort is something to escape. When attention remains present with discomfort without escalation, the system learns a different lesson. Discomfort becomes tolerable. It does not automatically require avoidance. This learning is especially important for patterns driven by fear or anxiety. Fear persists when avoidance is consistently reinforced. Attention that allows fear to be present without immediate avoidance creates a new outcome. The feared state occurs, and nothing catastrophic follows. Over time, the prediction updates. This does not mean forcing oneself into overwhelming situations. Overwhelm shuts down learning. The key is tolerable exposure. Attention stays present within a manageable range. The system receives evidence without triggering full survival mode. This balance is delicate but critical. Attention also influences emotional regulation by changing how states are categorized. When emotions are observed rather than immediately labeled or judged, their boundaries become clearer. A feeling that once seemed global may be experienced as localized. Tension may be noticed in the chest rather than interpreted as a personal failure. This specificity matters. The subconscious responds differently to concrete sensations than to abstract conclusions. Labeling is another way attention can shape learning. Simply naming an experience as it arises can alter how it is processed. This is not because words have magical power, but because labeling recruits different neural circuits. It adds context without suppression. The experience is acknowledged rather than avoided. Over time, this acknowledgement changes prediction. The system learns that noticing a feeling does not necessarily lead to escalation. It learns that awareness itself is safe. This may sound minor, but for systems trained under stress, it is significant. Attention also plays a role in breaking cognitive habits. Repetitive thought patterns often persist because they are automatically reinforced. Each repetition strengthens the pathway. Mindfulness interrupts this reinforcement by noticing the thought without elaborating it. The thought arises, is recognized, and passes without being extended. This deprives the pattern of additional reinforcement. Importantly, this does not mean stopping thoughts. Thoughts arise automatically. The change lies in what happens next. Attention chooses whether to engage or not. Over time, non-engagement weakens the pattern. The subconscious learns that the thought is not required for problem solving. Attention also affects memory consolidation. What you attend to repeatedly is more likely to be encoded. Mindfulness can shift what receives attention. By noticing neutral or positive aspects of experience that were previously ignored, the system begins to register a broader range of information. This can gradually rebalance emotional weighting. This is why practices that train attention often lead to subtle changes in mood over time. The world does not necessarily change. What is noticed changes. The subconscious updates its predictions based on this new data. It begins to expect a wider range of outcomes. Another way attention gains influence is through timing. Early attention has more impact than late attention. Noticing a cue as it arises, rather than after a reaction has unfolded, allows more flexibility. This is why mindfulness practices often emphasize awareness of early bodily signals. Catching the beginning of a pattern is easier than interrupting it midstream. This timing advantage does not require perfection. Even noticing after the fact provides information. The system learns that awareness can occur. Over time, awareness tends to arise earlier. This shift is gradual and often unnoticed until it becomes reliable. It is also important to understand that attention itself is trainable. The ability to sustain or redirect attention improves with practice. This is not because attention becomes stronger in a moral sense. It is because the neural systems involved become more efficient. What was once effortful becomes easier. The subconscious learns that maintaining awareness is a viable state. This learning affects default behavior. With practice, the baseline level of awareness increases. Automatic patterns still occur, but they are noticed sooner. This earlier noticing creates more opportunities for influence. Attention also interacts with compassion. Harsh self-judgment narrows attention and increases threat. Curiosity broadens attention and signals safety. The subconscious responds differently under these conditions. Learning occurs more readily when the system does not feel attacked. This is why approaches that emphasize gentle awareness often succeed where forceful ones fail. Another subtle but important factor is consistency. Occasional attention has limited impact. Regular practice, even in small amounts, accumulates. The subconscious tracks frequency. It notices that awareness is present again and again. This repetition matters more than intensity. It is also worth noting that attention does not always feel productive. Sitting with experience without changing it can feel pointless. The effects are not immediately visible because they occur beneath awareness. Over time, however, patterns shift. Reactions soften. Space appears. These changes are often recognized only in retrospect. Attention also helps differentiate between old patterns and present reality. By observing what is actually happening rather than what is expected, discrepancies become visible. This provides the prediction system with new information. The world is not exactly as it was before. The body responds differently. Outcomes vary. These differences matter. One common frustration is the expectation that mindfulness should eliminate unwanted experiences. When it does not, people conclude it is ineffective. This expectation misunderstands the mechanism. Mindfulness changes the relationship to experience, not the experience itself. The reduction in intensity or frequency comes later, as a consequence of updated learning. It is also important to acknowledge limits. Attention cannot override severe deprivation, trauma, or overwhelming stress. In such conditions, survival systems dominate. Attention may still help, but it is not sufficient on its own. Supportive environments and external changes are often required. Attention is a lever, not a solution. It works best when combined with conditions that support learning: safety, repetition, rest, and consistency. Used in isolation, it can feel frustrating. Used as part of a broader context, it becomes powerful. Understanding attention as a way of shaping what the subconscious learns reframes effort. The goal is not to control thoughts or feelings, but to create conditions where new patterns can emerge. Attention provides continuity. It stays with experience long enough for the system to register it. As this exploration continues, the next focus will be on what happens when subconscious systems misfire. Automatic processes are efficient, but they are not perfect. Under certain conditions, they produce patterns that cause unnecessary distress or impairment. Understanding how and why these misfires occur helps clarify when influence is enough and when additional intervention becomes necessary, as the mind continues to apply ancient learning rules to modern situations that do not always fit. The subconscious is remarkably efficient, but it is not infallible. The same mechanisms that allow it to predict, automate, and protect can also produce patterns that are mismatched to the present moment. When this happens, the system is not malfunctioning in a mechanical sense. It is applying old rules to new conditions. These moments are what can be described as misfires, not because something is broken, but because the prediction no longer fits the reality it's trying to manage. A misfire occurs when a learned response activates in a context where it is no longer appropriate or helpful. The response itself may once have been adaptive. It may even have been essential. Over time, however, the environment changed while the prediction did not update sufficiently. the subconscious continues to act as if the old conditions still apply. One of the most common examples is anxiety that arises in situations that are objectively safe. The fear response activates. The body prepares for threat. Attention narrows, yet no immediate danger is present. From the outside, this looks irrational. From the inside, it feels very real. The system is responding to pattern similarity, not to current risk. These misfires are especially common in modern life because the environments humans now inhabit differ dramatically from the ones in which these systems evolved. Many threats today are abstract, delayed, or symbolic. Deadlines, evaluations, social comparison, and uncertainty about the future can activate survival programs that were designed for immediate physical danger. The response is intense because the system does not distinguish between types of threat. It distinguishes between signals that resemble past harm. Another form of misfire involves habits that persist despite negative consequences. A behavior may continue even when it causes distress, conflict, or regret. From a conscious perspective, this feels baffling. From a subconscious perspective, the behavior still serves a function. It may reduce discomfort in the short term, provide predictability, or restore a familiar state. The long-term cost is not part of the evaluation. This mismatch between short-term relief and long-term harm is one of the most common sources of frustration. People often assume that once the harm is understood, the behavior should stop. When it does not, they interpret this as weakness or lack of discipline. In reality, the system is prioritizing immediate stabilization over abstract future outcomes. The misfire lies not in the behavior, but in the outdated weighting of consequences. Misfires also occur in social perception. The subconscious is quick to infer intention and meaning from limited cues. This speed is useful in many situations, but it can lead to errors when cues are ambiguous or unfamiliar. A neutral expression may be read as disapproval. A delayed response may be interpreted as rejection. These interpretations feel certain because they arise automatically. Once an interpretation is formed, it shapes emotional response and behavior. Defensive or withdrawn behavior may follow. That behavior can then influence the interaction, sometimes creating the very outcome that was feared. The system learns from this sequence and strengthens the original prediction. The misfire becomes self-reinforcing. Another area where misfires are common is bodily sensation. The subconscious constantly monitors internal signals, but it does not always interpret them accurately. A racing heart may be read as panic rather than exertion. Fatigue may be read as failure rather than depletion. These interpretations shape emotional response and behavior. The body becomes a source of threat rather than information. This misinterpretation is more likely under stress. When the system is already alert, it is biased toward danger. Neutral signals are more likely to be interpreted pessimistically. This creates feedback loops where stress amplifies itself. The original trigger may have been minor, but the response grows through repeated misinterpretation. Misfires also occur in attention. The subconscious decides what is relevant, but relevance is learned. If a certain type of thought or sensation was once associated with threat, attention may become fixated on it. This fixation can persist even when the threat is no longer present. The system treats attention as a form of monitoring. If something feels unresolved, attention keeps returning to it. This is particularly evident in rumination. Repetitive thinking often feels purposeful, as if the mind is trying to solve a problem. In reality, the subconscious is flagging uncertainty and attempting to reduce it through mental rehearsal. When the problem cannot be solved through thinking alone, the loop continues. The misfire lies in the assumption that repetition will lead to resolution. Intrusive thoughts are another example. These thoughts often arise suddenly and feel inconsistent with conscious values. They can be disturbing precisely because they feel uncontrollable. From a subconscious perspective, they are attempts to simulate possible threats or violations. The system is testing scenarios to ensure preparedness. The misfire occurs when the simulation itself becomes a source of distress. Importantly, the presence of a thought does not indicate intention or desire. The subconscious generates content based on relevance, not endorsement. Treating intrusive thoughts as meaningful statements about the self strengthens their impact. Treating them as mental noise reduces it. The misfire is not the thought, but the interpretation. Another common misfire involves emotional generalization. A feeling associated with one context spreads to others. A person who learned that vulnerability led to pain may feel guarded even in supportive relationships. The system learned that openness was risky. It applies that rule broadly to reduce exposure. The misfire persists because the system has not experienced enough counterexamples in similar contexts. Misfires are also common during periods of transition. When roles, environments, or expectations change, the predictive system struggles. Old patterns no longer fit, but new ones are not yet established. During this period, anxiety, irritability, and confusion increase. The system is actively updating, but the process is uncomfortable. This discomfort is often mistaken for failure. In reality, it is a sign of learning. Prediction error is increasing. The system is receiving data that does not match its model. Until a new model stabilizes, uncertainty remains high. The misfire is temporary, but it can feel destabilizing. Another source of misfire is chronic stress. When the system is under constant load, it prioritizes efficiency over nuance. Automatic responses dominate. Thresholds lower. Reactions become exaggerated. In this state, even minor challenges can trigger strong responses. The system is conserving resources by relying on familiar patterns, even if they are imperfect. Sleep deprivation intensifies this effect. Without adequate rest, emotional regulation weakens, attention narrows, and threat sensitivity increases. The subconscious becomes more reactive and less flexible. Misfires become more frequent, not because the person has changed, but because the system lacks the resources to recalibrate. Misfires also occur when learning is incomplete or contradictory. If a behavior sometimes leads to relief and sometimes to harm, the system struggles to settle on a prediction. This uncertainty can produce erratic responses. The system alternates between patterns, unsure which is safer. From the inside, this feels like inconsistency or inner conflict. Another important factor is early learning. Patterns formed under intense conditions, especially in childhood, tend to be deeply ingrained. The system learned them when alternatives were limited. These patterns can persist long after the original conditions have changed. The misfire lies not in the pattern itself, but in its continued application without updating. It is also important to recognize that misfires are not evenly distributed. Some people experience them more frequently due to temperament, history, or environment. A system that learned the world was unpredictable will remain vigilant. A system that learned it was stable will be more flexible. These differences are not moral, they are adaptive responses to different conditions. Misfires can also be reinforced by attempts to suppress them. When an unwanted thought, feeling, or urge is treated as dangerous, the system flags it as important. Attention increases, monitoring intensifies, the misfire becomes more prominent. The system interprets suppression as evidence of threat. This is why many attempts to eliminate symptoms backfire. The goal of elimination creates pressure. Pressure signals danger. The subconscious responds by increasing vigilance. The pattern strengthens. The misfire persists not because it is correct, but because it is being treated as urgent. Understanding misfires changes how they are approached. The goal is not to eliminate automatic responses, but to update the predictions behind them. This requires experience that contradicts the old pattern in a tolerable way. It requires patience because the system updates gradually. One of the most important steps in addressing misfires is distinguishing between signal and noise. Not every reaction reflects current reality. Some reflect history. Recognizing this does not require arguing with the reaction. It requires contextualizing it. The feeling can be present without being obeyed. Another step involves reducing system load. Adequate rest, predictable routines, and supportive environments lower baseline arousal. This makes misfires less frequent and less intense. The system becomes more flexible because it has more capacity to process nuance. Misfires also become easier to address when curiosity replaces judgment. Judgment increases threat. Curiosity increases safety. When a reaction is approached with interest rather than alarm, the system receives a different signal. It learns that awareness is not dangerous. It is also helpful to remember that misfires are not permanent. The subconscious is plastic. It continues to learn. Patterns that feel entrenched can soften with time and consistent experience. Progress is often uneven because learning is context-dependent. Misfires are also information. They reveal where the system is still protecting, still expecting harm, still relying on old rules. They point to places where safety has not yet been fully demonstrated. Seen this way, they are not obstacles, but indicators. This perspective does not minimize suffering. Misfires can be deeply distressing. Anxiety, compulsions, and intrusive thoughts can impair daily life. In some cases, additional support is necessary. The presence of misfires does not mean one should handle everything alone. It means the system is under strain. Understanding why misfires occur helps clarify when influence through attention and environment is enough, and when additional intervention is needed. It also helps remove unnecessary self-blame. The system is not failing. It is doing its best with the information it has. As this exploration approaches its final stretch, the focus turns toward what it means to live with a system like this rather than against it. The subconscious will never be silent. It will never stop predicting, reacting, and learning. The question is not how to eliminate its influence, but how to coexist with it in a way that reduces friction and increases flexibility, allowing the mind to continue adjusting as conditions change, carrying these ancient processes forward into daily life without being ruled by every signal they produce. Living with the mind that lives beneath awareness does not mean gaining control over it. It means understanding its tendencies, respecting its limits, and learning how to move with it rather than constantly pushing against it. The subconscious is not something that can be turned off, outgrown, or transcended. It is an active, adaptive system that has been shaping perception, emotion, and behavior since long before conscious thought existed. The challenge is not to escape its influence, but to live intelligently within it. One of the most useful shifts is abandoning the idea that the subconscious should always agree with conscious intention. Disagreement does not mean failure. It means different systems are operating with different information, priorities, and time horizons. Conscious thought is focused on goals, meaning, and narrative coherence. The subconscious is focused on safety, efficiency, and prediction. Conflict arises not because one system is wrong, but because they are solving different problems. When this conflict is interpreted as a personal flaw, it creates unnecessary tension. People often respond by tightening control, judging themselves harshly, or demanding immediate change. These responses usually increase strain. Strain signals threat. Threat strengthens automatic patterns. The loop continues. Understanding the system changes the response. Instead of escalation, there is room for negotiation. Negotiation does not happen through internal debate. It happens through conditions. The subconscious listens to experience, not instruction. It updates when the environment repeatedly shows that something different is possible and safe. Living well with it means arranging conditions that allow those updates to occur naturally over time. This begins with realism about limits. There are moments when conscious influence is minimal. Fatigue, hunger, illness, emotional overload, and acute stress all reduce flexibility. In these states, expecting insight or self-control is unrealistic. Automatic patterns dominate because the system is conserving resources. Living wisely means recognizing these moments and adjusting expectations rather than forcing performance. This is not resignation, it is strategic adaptation. Choosing when to engage effort and when to reduce demands is itself a form of influence. The subconscious learns from these choices. When rest follows strain, the system learns that recovery is possible. When strain is unrelenting, the system learns vigilance. Another important aspect is consistency. The subconscious is highly sensitive to repetition. Dramatic efforts followed by collapse teach instability. Small, steady patterns teach reliability. Living with the subconscious means favoring changes that can be sustained, rather than those that impress briefly. This applies to behavior, attention, and environment. A minor routine repeated daily has more impact than an ambitious plan abandoned after a week. The system trusts what persists. It discounts what fluctuates. Patience is not just a virtue here. It is a requirement imposed by the learning mechanism itself. Living with the subconscious also means redefining progress. Progress is not the absence of old patterns. It is their reduced dominance. Old responses may still arise, especially under stress. The difference is that they no longer dictate behavior automatically. Awareness arrives sooner. Recovery happens faster. The system has alternatives. These changes are often subtle. They may not feel like breakthroughs. They show up as slightly more space between urge and action, slightly less intensity in emotional response, slightly more tolerance for uncertainty. Over time, these small shifts accumulate. Looking back, the landscape appears different even if no single moment marked the transition. Another key aspect is relationship with discomfort. The subconscious learned many of its patterns in response to discomfort. It learned what reduced it quickly. Living well with it does not require eliminating discomfort, which is impossible. It requires learning which forms of discomfort are tolerable and which truly signal danger. This distinction is learned through experience. When discomfort is met with curiosity rather than alarm, the system receives new information. It learns that not all discomfort requires immediate escape. This does not happen through endurance or suppression. It happens through presence within tolerable limits. Over time, the range of tolerable experience expands. The system recalibrates. What once felt overwhelming may become manageable. This expansion is one of the clearest signs of subconscious change. It reflects increased trust in the organism's ability to cope. Living with the subconscious also involves recognizing that not all signals require action. Thoughts, feelings, urges, and bodily sensations arise continuously. The subconscious generates many of them as simulations or alerts. Treating every signal as a command leads to exhaustion. Learning to let signals pass without escalation is a skill developed through repetition. This skill does not mean ignoring signals. It means differentiating between information and instruction. A feeling can be present without dictating behavior. A thought can occur without being believed. This differentiation is subtle but powerful. It reduces reactivity without suppressing experience. Another important element is self-compassion, not as a moral stance but as a practical one. Harsh self-judgment increases threat. Threat strengthens defensive patterns. Compassion signals safety. Safety increases flexibility. The subconscious responds to tone as much as to content. How you respond to yourself matters because it alters internal conditions. This does not mean excusing harmful behavior or avoiding responsibility. It means addressing patterns without adding unnecessary threat. Responsibility and compassion are not opposites at this level. They are complementary. Accountability without safety leads to rigidity. Safety without accountability leads to stagnation. Balance supports learning. Living with the subconscious also means paying attention to environment. The system is exquisitely sensitive to cues. Noise, light, social context, routine, and predictability all shape baseline state. Small environmental changes can have large effects on automatic behavior. This is why sustainable change often involves rearranging surroundings rather than relying on willpower. Reducing friction for desired behaviors and increasing friction for undesired ones works because it alters what the subconscious encounters repeatedly. The system adapts without requiring constant effort. Social environment deserves particular attention. Humans evolved in groups. Signals of acceptance, predictability, and support regulate the nervous system. Chronic social uncertainty increases vigilance. Living with the subconscious means taking social context seriously, not as an optional extra, but as a primary influence on mental state. This does not mean surrounding oneself only with comfort. It means recognizing which interactions are destabilizing and which are regulating. It means allowing recovery after social strain. The system learns from patterns of interaction, not from ideals about how social life should feel. Another aspect is respecting the role of the body. The subconscious communicates through physiology. Ignoring bodily signals leads to misinterpretation and escalation. Attending to sleep, nutrition, movement, and rest is not self-indulgence. It is system maintenance. A depleted body limits learning and flexibility. Living with the subconscious also involves accepting that clarity is not constant. There will be periods of confusion, indecision, or emotional noise. These periods often coincide with learning. The system is updating. Predictions are unstable. Old models are being challenged. Expecting certainty in these moments adds pressure. Allowing uncertainty without immediate resolution creates space for new patterns to form. This is uncomfortable because the mind prefers closure. But closure too early often reinforces old patterns. Patience allows the system to gather more data. Another useful shift is reframing setbacks. A setback is not evidence of failure. It is information about context, load, or safety. When an old pattern reappears, it indicates that the conditions resembled those under which it was learned. This information can guide adjustment rather than judgment. Living with the subconscious means expecting fluctuation. Progress is rarely linear. There are advances, plateaus, and regressions. This reflects the system's conservative updating. Recognizing this pattern reduces discouragement and supports persistence. It is also important to recognize when additional support is needed. The subconscious is powerful, but it is not invincible. Trauma, chronic stress, and significant mental health conditions can overwhelm self-directed strategies. Seeking support is not a failure of understanding. It is a response to system overload. Professional support, medication, and structured interventions can alter conditions enough for learning to resume. They are not shortcuts. They are tools that change the environment in which the subconscious operates. Used appropriately, they can restore flexibility. Living with the subconscious also means letting go of the fantasy of complete self-mastery. There will always be automatic reactions. There will always be moments when the system moves faster than awareness. This is not something to overcome. It is something to accommodate. Accommodation involves designing life in ways that align with how the system actually works, rather than how one wishes it worked. This alignment reduces friction. It allows energy to be directed toward what matters rather than toward constant self-correction. Another important realization is that the subconscious is not opposed to growth. It is opposed to unpredictability and harm. When growth is presented as exploration rather than threat, the system can support it. Curiosity is safer than force. Incremental change is safer than abrupt overhaul. Living with the subconscious also means recognizing its strengths. It handles complexity effortlessly. It integrates vast amounts of information. It allows skilled action without conscious micromanagement. Appreciating these strengths reduces the impulse to treat it as an obstacle. Many of the most meaningful experiences in life arise when conscious and subconscious processes align. In these moments, action feels fluid. Decisions feel clear. Effort feels minimal. These states are not accidents. They emerge when conditions support coherence. Creating those conditions is not a one-time task. It is an ongoing process of adjustment. Life changes. The system adapts. Living well with the subconscious means staying responsive to these changes, rather than clinging to fixed expectations. Another useful perspective is seeing the subconscious as a long-term partner rather than a problem to solve. It has its own logic. It has its own pace. Learning to communicate with it through experience rather than instruction improves cooperation over time. This communication is subtle. It happens through repetition, environment, attention, and tone. It does not respond to urgency or demand. It responds to reliability. Living with the subconscious also involves recognizing that meaning does not come from complete control. It comes from participation. You're not separate from these processes. You're an expression of them. Conscious thought is one part of a larger system that includes automatic learning, emotion, memory, and bodily regulation. Seeing yourself this way does not diminish agency. It grounds it. Agency becomes the capacity to influence conditions rather than to command outcomes. This form of agency is quieter, slower, and more realistic. It works with the grain of the system rather than against it. Over time, this approach leads to a different relationship with the mind. There is less urgency to fix, less pressure to eliminate unwanted experiences, and more interest in understanding patterns. The system feels less like an adversary and more like an evolving process. The subconscious will continue to run much of life. It will continue to predict, automate, and protect. The goal is not to stop this, but to shape what it learns by shaping what it encounters. This shaping happens moment by moment, often unnoticed through the way attention is placed, the environments that are chosen, and the responses that are repeated. Living with the mind that lives beneath awareness is not about achieving a final state. There is no endpoint where learning stops. There is only ongoing adaptation. The system adjusts as conditions change. Awareness participates where it can. Together they carry experience forward, not toward perfection, but toward increasing coherence, flexibility, and understanding as life continues to unfold.